Von Calder didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Rourke Varden's ranch swung open like he already owned the place, because in his mind he already did. He dropped a single folded document onto the kitchen table, right on top of Rourke's morning coffee cup, and let it sit there like a sentence that had already been finished. 60 days, Calder said. That's what the mortgage says. 60 days from yesterday. He smiled the way a man smiles when he's already counted the money. I bought your debt last Thursday, Varden. Every cent of it. You didn't even notice, did you? He walked back out without waiting for an answer. If you've ever watched a man realize the ground beneath him just disappeared, you understand what happened in that kitchen. And that was only the beginning. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Because what Lenora Blythe does when she finds out, nobody saw that coming. Nobody. The stagecoach from Cheyenne ran 3 hours behind schedule, which gave Rourke Varden plenty of time to stand in the Wyoming dust outside Cinder Ridge and feel like an absolute fool. He'd worn his good shirt. The dark blue one with the clean collar that he'd ironed himself that morning, burning his left thumb in the process because he hadn't ironed anything in 4 years and had forgotten which end of the iron got hot first. He'd combed his hair. He'd even polished his boots, which was something he hadn't done since his brother Danny's funeral, and that fact was not lost on him as he stood there watching the horizon for a cloud of dust that kept refusing to appear. 41 letters. That's what he and Lenora Blythe had between them. 41 letters exchanged over 18 months, passed through a correspondence agency in Cincinnati that matched working men in the territories with educated women looking for something different than what their cities were offering. Rourke had written his first letter, sitting at the kitchen table on a February night when the wind was so bad he could hear it pulling at the cabin corners. And he'd sat there for 20 minutes with a blank page in front of him before he wrote the only honest thing he could think of. I'm not sure I know how to do this. I have a ranch that needs a great deal of work and not enough hands to do it. I lost my brother 3 winters ago and I haven't been the same since. I'm not looking for someone to fix me. I'm not sure that's possible. But I am tired of talking to cattle. He'd almost thrown it away. It seemed too raw, too strange. Too much like something a broken man would write, which he supposed was exactly what he was, but he'd sent it. And 3 weeks later, Lenora Blythe had written back. I have been a bookkeeper for 11 years and the answer to "How are you?" for most of that time. I cared for my aunt during her final illness, and after she passed, I looked around at my life and realized I had organized it into very neat columns, all of which added up to very little. I am not looking for rescue either. I am looking for someone who will let me be useful in ways that actually matter. That was the beginning. What followed were 40 more letters, increasingly honest, increasingly specific Rourke, describing the exact way the light hit Blackwillow Creek in early morning. Lenora describing the particular silence of a Cincinnati boarding house at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. He'd told her about Danny, not the surface version, not the cleaned-up version you tell people at a funeral. The real one, the argument they'd had the week before, the words he wished he could take back, the way he still sometimes reached his brother in the dark half-second when he was only partially awake and hadn't remembered yet. She'd told him about her aunt, how the woman had been sharp and demanding and occasionally cruel the way sick people can be when they're frightened, and how Lenora had stayed anyway because leaving was not something she was built for, but also how she'd cried in the washroom every single day for the last 6 months of it and had never told anyone until she wrote it down in a letter to a cattle rancher she'd never met. That's the thing about letters. You say things in them you'd never say out loud. So when the stagecoach finally materialized out of the eastern dust at 20 past 3 in the afternoon, Rourke Varden experienced something he had not anticipated: absolute terror. He knew this woman. He knew her handwriting, her sense of humor, the way she described things she was angry about, by first describing them very calmly, and then, 3 sentences later, suddenly and completely losing her composure on the page. He knew she disliked people who interrupted, and had a complicated relationship with her own ambition, and made coffee so strong it was practically a solid. He did not know her face. He did not know her voice. He did not know what she looked like, climbing down from a stagecoach after 3 days of hard travel, tired and dusty, and probably furious about running behind schedule. The door swung open and 3 passengers climbed out. An older man in a merchant's coat, a woman in her 50s with a carpet bag, and then a woman in a dusty green traveling dress, dark hair pinned up but coming loose on the left side, a book tucked under her arm that she'd clearly been reading because she had her thumb in it to hold her place even while climbing down the steps. She looked up, squinting in the afternoon sun, scanning the small gathered crowd with the direct, unapologetic attention of someone who was not inclined to be bashful about looking for what she came to find. Her eyes found Rourke. Something happened. He couldn't have described it if someone had held a gun to his head. It wasn't romantic in the way the word usually got used. It wasn't soft or pretty or accompanied by violins. It was more like the click of a door settling into its frame. A recognition so specific it was almost physical. She walked toward him and he walked toward her, and when they were close enough, she stopped. "Rourke Varden," she said. "Not a question." "Lenora Blythe," he said. Also not a question. There was a pause in which both of them seemed to be recalibrating some internal calculation. Then, without either of them quite deciding to, they stepped forward, and she put her free arm around him, still holding the book with the other hand, which struck him later as one of the most Lenora things she had ever done, and he put both arms around her, and they stood there in the middle of the Cinder Ridge Road for a moment that felt about 8 times longer than it actually was. She stepped back first. Her cheeks were flushed. She adjusted the book under her arm and looked somewhere around his shoulder for a moment. "I wasn't sure what I'd feel," she said, "when I actually saw you." "And?" She looked at him directly. "It doesn't feel like I arrived somewhere new. It feels like I finally came home." He didn't have a good answer for that. He picked up her traveling bag because that was something he could do, and she fell into step beside him toward the wagon, and they started talking not carefully, not with the measured deliberateness of letters, but in the overlapping, interrupting, backing up way of people who have too much to say and aren't willing to wait for the right moment anymore. That was day 1. Day 1 was, in retrospect, the last uncomplicated day they would have for quite some time. The ranch sat 8 miles outside Cinder Ridge on a stretch of land that Rourke had spent 11 years building piece by piece, starting with 40 acres and a single structure that barely qualified as a cabin, slowly adding fencing and a proper barn and a second outbuilding and a creek-fed watering system he'd engineered himself over 2 winters. It wasn't impressive by the standards of the valley's bigger operations, but it was his. Every fence post had his hands on it. Every drainage channel had been dug with his back. Lenora stood on the porch the first evening and looked at it and said, "Tell me what needs fixing first." "That's not." He stopped. "You just arrived, I'm aware of that." She turned and looked at him. "I didn't ask what needs fixing eventually. I asked what needs fixing first." There's a difference. He thought about arguing. He thought about telling her she should rest, settle in, get her bearings. He thought about several different versions of that conversation, and in all of them she said something that ended it efficiently. So instead he said, "The ledgers. Show me." He showed her. The ledgers were, to put it charitably, a disaster. Not because Rourke was dishonest or careless. He wasn't either of those things, but because bookkeeping required a particular kind of organized mind that he had never possessed. He could build a fence line with his eyes closed. He could read a herd for illness before the animal was showing visible symptoms. Numbers on a page, organized into columns that were supposed to tell him something coherent about his financial standing, consistently turned into a blur within 4 minutes of sitting down with them. Lenora sat at the kitchen table with the 3 leather-bound ledgers stacked in front of her, a cup of the extremely strong coffee she'd made without asking where things were, and the expression of a person who has found a problem they know exactly how to solve. She worked for 2 hours without speaking much. Rourke sat across from her and watched, partly because he wanted to understand what she was finding, and partly because he was still trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the person he'd been imagining for 18 months. She was different in motion than he'd pictured, more direct, less patient with things that didn't matter. She had a way of pressing her thumb against her lower lip when she was reading something that she found irritating, which, over the course of 2 hours with his ledgers, happened frequently. Garrick Sloan, she said finally. He's the main supplier for the valley. Feed, equipment, dry goods. He's been overcharging you. She turned the ledger around and pointed. Look at this entry, and this one, and this column here. Her finger moved down the page. He's been adding a territory handling fee that isn't in your original contract. Small enough that it doesn't scream at you. Big enough that over 3 years, it adds up to, she did a rapid calculation in her head, somewhere around $240. Rourke stared at the page. $240 was nearly a third of what a good hand made in a year. Are you certain? I'm a bookkeeper, she said, with the precise tone of someone who did not appreciate the question. Yes, I'm certain. Sloan has been supplying this valley for 20 years. He's been stealing from you for at least 3. She closed the ledger. What do you want to do about it? What he wanted to do about it involved language that wasn't appropriate to use in front of a woman he'd known for less than 12 hours. What he said was, I'll talk to him. We'll talk to him, Lenora said, and turned to the next ledger. They went to Sloan's supply store the following afternoon. Garrick Sloan was a thick-shouldered man in his late 50s, with the permanent expression of someone who was doing you a favor by existing. He ran his store with the lazy confidence of a man who understood that in a territory where supplies were scarce, the supplier had a certain natural authority. That authority met Lenora Blythe and had a difficult afternoon. She walked in, set the ledger on the counter, opened it to the page she'd marked, and said, pleasantly, Mr. Sloan, I'm Rourke Varden's bookkeeper. I've identified a billing error in his account. I'd like to correct it today if possible. Sloan looked at the ledger, then at Rourke, then back at Lenora with the expression men use when they're deciding whether a woman is worth taking seriously. He made the wrong decision. Billing's correct, he said. Territory handling's been standard since. It's not in the contract, Lenora said. Her voice didn't change temperature at all. The contract is dated March 1883. There is no territory handling provision. The fee appeared for the first time in a ledger entry from September of that year, without any corresponding amendment to the original agreement. She turned the ledger around so he could see the page. $243.60, compounded over 31 months. She looked at him. I've already drafted a restitution request. We can settle it here or through a territorial court proceeding. I'm comfortable either way. Sloan stared at her. Rourke, standing 2 feet to her left, said nothing. He'd learned in approximately 24 hours that the moments when Lenora went very quiet and very pleasant were precisely the moments when she required no assistance whatsoever. Sloan pulled $243.60 from his lockbox by the end of the day. Word traveled. It always traveled, in small territories where information was the only currency that moved faster than cattle. Within a week, 3 neighboring ranch families had shown up at Rourke's door, asking if Lenora would look at their accounts. She said yes. She sat at the kitchen table with their records, the way other people might sit with a puzzle, focused and unhurried, and she found things. She found overcharges and miscalculations and loan provisions that didn't match what people had been told they were signing. She found, in the account of a family named Kettrick, a supply debt that seemed to have grown beyond any reasonable explanation. She found that Kettrick's mortgage, originally held by a Cheyenne bank, had been sold to Von Calder. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went looking in the other accounts and in Rourke's ledgers, and she sat with what she found there for considerably longer. That night, after the Kettrick family had gone home, Lenora stood at the kitchen window for 10 minutes without saying anything. Rourke could read her silences now. Not perfectly, he was still learning, but well enough to know that this one was the kind that preceded something serious. Sit down, she said. Please. He sat. She turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed. She looked like someone who had decided to deliver news carefully and was now having second thoughts about the carefully part. Von Calder, she said. What do you know about him? Rourke's jaw tightened. It was the only visible sign. Cattle, speculator out of Laramie. He's been buying land in the territory for 3-4 years. He's well connected. He bought your mortgage, Lenora said. 4 weeks ago. He purchased this note from the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne. which means your debt is now owed to him and not to a bank, and he controls the terms of collection. She paused. The 60s a day notice that arrived last week that was from him. I found the documentation in your business correspondence. The envelope you hadn't opened yet. Rourke stared at her. You have 60 days to pay the full remaining balance, or he can initiate foreclosure proceedings. Her voice was steady. The remaining balance is $412, which, based on your current liquid holdings, you don't have. The silence in the kitchen lasted a long time. How long have you known? Lenora asked. About the balance? A while. About Calder? Another pause. Few weeks. She looked at him with an expression he was going to learn to dread, not because it was cold, but because it was the precise opposite, because it was hurt, trying very hard to look like something else. You knew when I arrived. Yes. You let me come anyway. Going to tell you. He stopped. Started again. I thought maybe I could fix it before you got here. Maybe there was still something, Rourke. I know. You wrote me 41 letters about your grief and your brother and your fears, and you decided this was the thing to keep private. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. You decided I couldn't be trusted with the actual situation I was walking into. I thought you'd change your mind about coming. Of course I would have had questions. She pushed off from the counter. That's not the same as changing my mind. You don't know that's what would have happened. You decided it for me. She looked at him directly. That's not partnership. That's management. He didn't argue. She was right, and he knew she was right, and the worst part was that he'd known it was wrong when he was doing it. He justified it in 17 different ways over 3 weeks, and not one of them had actually held up. I'm sorry, he said. Lenora picked up the ledger from the table, then set it back down, then sat down across from him. Tell me everything, she said, from the beginning. Don't decide what I need to know. Tell me all of it. So he did. He told her about the mortgage, the original terms, the bad winter 2 years ago that had cut his herd value by 1/3. He told her about Calder approaching him 6 months ago, ostensibly to discuss a land purchase, and how Rourke had turned him down. He told her about the loan being sold, the notice arriving, the 60-day window that was now 53 days. Lenora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, How many of the neighboring families have debt situations like this? I don't. The Kettricks do. Mrs. Aldermore said something last week about her husband's account being transferred. She was already pulling ledgers back toward her. How many families in this valley are on margin with their supply debts and their land notes? Most of them, Rourke said slowly. It's been 2 bad winters. Bring me their contracts, she said. Not tomorrow. Tonight, if you can reach anyone. He looked at her across the table. Lenora, you don't have to, Rourke. She looked up from the ledger. Don't. He went to get his coat. It took 3 evenings of riding to neighboring ranches, and 1 morning of Lenora going door to door in Cinder Ridge herself, which she did without telling him, so that he found out from the Kettricks, who mentioned it with the slightly odd tone people were already starting to use when discussing her. But by the end of the week, they had 12 sets of ranch financial documents spread across the kitchen table and the floor. Lenora worked through them for 2 days. She barely slept. Rourke brought her coffee and food, and she ate without really noticing, the way she did when her mind was locked onto something. He watched her work and thought about the letters she'd written him, all the times she'd described being useful in ways that mattered, and understood that he was watching what that actually looked like for her. On the second evening, she straightened up from the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface. Come here, she said. He came around the table and stood beside her. She had arranged the documents into a rough geographic pattern, using a penciled sketch of the valley that she'd drawn from memory based on conversations with the neighboring families. At the center of the sketch was Blackwillow Creek, the long, irregular line of water that ran through the valley's middle. Calder doesn't want ranches, she said. He wants water. She pointed. Your 40 acres contain the central passage of the creek right here. Kettrick's land sits on the eastern branch. The Aldermore property controls the northern fork. The Hammond spread goes here, which is the confluence point. Her finger traced the acquisitions. He's not buying debt randomly. He's buying specific debts on specific properties, because those properties together give him control of every significant water source in the valley. Rourke stared at the map. If he forecloses on your ranch and the Kettricks and the Aldermores and the Hammonds, the remaining valley families don't have reliable water access during drought. They either sell their land to him at whatever price he decides to offer, or they leave. She looked at him. That's the plan. That's all of it. The kitchen was very quiet. We have 51 days, Rourke said. We have 51 days, she agreed. She looked back at the map with the expression she got when she was calculating something. Not worried exactly, not unworried either. The face of someone who understood the size of the problem clearly, and had not yet decided it was bigger than she was. Then we have work to do, she said. Outside, the Wyoming wind picked up and hit the cabin walls, and the kerosene lamp between them threw their shadows long against the floor. Rourke looked at the map. He looked at her. He thought about 41 letters and a 60-day deadline, and a woman who had crossed nearly 1,000 miles to find something real, and had managed, in less than 2 weeks, to understand the shape of his life better than he'd understood it himself. Lenora, she looked up. I'm sorry, he said again, for not telling you. She was quiet for a moment. I know you are. She turned back to the documents. Don't do it again. No, he said. I won't. And in that kitchen, with the lamp burning low and 12 families' futures spread across the table between them, something settled into place between Rourke Varden and the woman who had arrived in a dusty green dress with a book tucked under her arm. Not romance. Not exactly. Something older and less fragile than that. Partnership. And Vaughn Calder, sitting comfortable in his Laramie office at that very moment, had absolutely no idea that the bookkeeper from Cincinnati had just started drawing the map that would undo him. The map stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days. Lenora wouldn't let Rourke roll it up. She said she needed to be able to look at it while she was thinking, which meant that every meal they ate, every cup of coffee, every conversation about ordinary ranch business happened with Calder's acquisition sketched out between them in pencil lines and cramped handwriting. Rourke stopped seeing it after a while, the way you stop seeing a crack in a wall you've lived with too long. Lenora never stopped seeing it. He'd come in from the morning feeding and find her already at the table, still in her robe, thumb pressed against her lower lip, staring at the creek lines like they owed her something. You didn't sleep again, he said one morning. I slept some. How much is some? She looked up. Enough. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without commenting further, because he was learning which arguments were worth having and which ones would simply cost him energy he needed for other things. She wrapped both hands around the cup and went back to looking at the map. What are you stuck on? He asked. The timing. She tapped the paper near the Hammond property. Calder bought your mortgage 4 weeks ago. He bought the Kettrick note 6 weeks before that. The Aldermore loan transfer happened 2 months before the Kettricks. She traced the sequence with her finger. He's been building this for at least 8 months. Maybe longer, which means he wasn't reacting to a bad season, he was waiting for one. Rourke sat down across from her, planning for it. 2 bad winters gave him cover. Every family in this valley needed credit extensions or supply arrangements that pushed them further onto margin. He let that happen naturally and then moved in when the debts were deep enough that a bank would be motivated to sell the notes cheap. She finally looked up. This wasn't opportunism. He drew the map before we did. That landed heavier than she probably meant it to, and she saw it land. And for a moment her expression shifted into something that was not quite an apology but was in that neighborhood. Which means we're behind, Rourke said. Yes, but we're not finished. She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between them, not reassurance exactly, because neither of them was the kind of person who dealt in false reassurance, but something more like a mutual acknowledgement that the situation was genuinely bad and they were going to deal with it anyway. No, she said, we're not finished. She turned back to the map. The problem with uniting 12 ranch families was that 11 of them had perfectly good reasons for not trusting each other. Rourke explained this while he and Lenora rode out to the Kettrick property on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of cold, bright Wyoming day where the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the wind had an edge that meant business. The Kettricks and the Hammonds had a fence dispute 3 years ago that nearly came to blows, he said. Pete Aldermore and Silas Greer haven't spoken since Greer's bull damaged Aldermore's south pasture, and Greer said it wasn't his problem. The Whaley family thinks the Beaumont family jumps water rights during dry spells. He paused. The Beaumonts are probably right that the Whaleys are difficult. Lenora rode in silence for a moment. So they've been neighbors for years and spent most of that time building grievances against each other. That's the general shape of it, and Calder knows that. He'd have to. Rourke looked at the road ahead. It's why he went after them individually. He knew they wouldn't compare notes. Until now. She adjusted her grip on the reins. Here's what I want to do. I don't want to hold a meeting. Not yet. I want to talk to each family separately, show them their own documents, walk them through what I found. Let each of them reach the same conclusion on their own. She looked at him. People trust what they discover for themselves more than what someone tells them. That's going to take time we may not have. It's going to take 8 days, she said, with the precision of someone who had already worked out the schedule. 4 families this week, 4 next. I need you to introduce me to each of them personally. They need to see you standing behind what I'm telling them. He didn't like the timeline. He also couldn't argue with the logic. Fine, and Rourke, she glanced at him sidelong. Let me do the talking. He thought about pointing out that he knew these people, and she didn't. He thought about it for approximately 4 seconds, and then decided against it. Fine, he said again. The Kettricks were first. Frank Kettrick was 61, weathered past his age, with the slow, deliberate manner of a man who had learned to be suspicious of anything that arrived in a hurry. His wife Clara was quicker, sharp-eyed, and direct, the kind of woman who had clearly been running the practical side of the operation for years, while her husband handled the physical work. They sat at their own kitchen table across from Lenora and Rourke, and looked at the financial documents she'd spread between them with the specific wariness of people who had been surprised by bad news before. This transfer here, Lenora said, pointing. When the bank sold your note to a private creditor, did they notify you before it happened? Frank scratched the back of his neck, got a letter after, said the account had been purchased and future payments should go to a different address. Follow up? Ask who purchased it. Clara wrote a letter, Frank said. Never got a clear answer. Clara nodded. They sent back some legal language about private transaction confidentiality. I didn't know what to do with that. The purchaser is a man named Von Calder, Lenora said. He's a cattle speculator from Laramie. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. He also purchased Rourke's mortgage and the Aldermore loan. And I believe the Hammond note, though I haven't confirmed that yet. Clara's eyes sharpened. How many? I'm still counting, Lenora said. That's why I'm here. I need to understand the full picture before I can tell you what it means. She turned to the page she'd marked. What I can tell you right now is that your debt, your neighbor's debts, and Rourke's mortgage are not separate situations. They're connected. Someone connected them deliberately. She looked from Clara to Frank. I'd like to show you how. Frank Kettrick was a man who made decisions slowly. He looked at his wife. His wife looked at the documents. Something moved between them that was 30 years of shared judgment about who to trust. Show us, Clara said. The Aldermores were harder. Pete Aldermore met them at the gate of his property with his arms crossed and the body language of a man who had decided on suspicion before they'd opened their mouths. I know who you are, he said to Lenora, without any preamble or pretense at friendliness. You're the woman who got Garrick Sloan to pay back Rourke's money. He said it like it was a character flaw. That's right, Lenora said pleasantly. Sloan does business with everyone in this valley. I know that. You go stirring up trouble with him and it affects everyone, not just Rourke. Rourke started to say something. Lenora's hand moved slightly at her side, not a gesture exactly, more like a small controlled motion that meant don't, and he stopped. Mr. Aldermore, she said, I understand your concern. And if I had cost your neighbors money or supply access, you'd be right to be angry. But Mr. Sloan continued doing business with everyone in the valley, including Rourke, after that conversation. He adjusted his billing practice and moved on. She tilted her head slightly. I'm here today about something different. It's about your land note. My land note is my business. It was, she said. 4 months ago, it became Von Calder's business. She watched his face. Did you know that? He didn't. She could see it in the way his crossed arms shifted slightly, not dropping but adjusting, some of the aggressive confidence replaced by something more uncertain. "I'd like to show you the documentation," she said. "You don't have to agree with my conclusions. You can look at the same documents I'm looking at and decide for yourself what they mean." He stared at her for a moment longer. Then he stepped back from the gate. By the end of the first week, they'd spoken with 6 families. By the end of the second, 11. The 12th, a widow named Eleanor Beaumont, who ran a small but well-maintained spread on the valley's western edge, came to Rourke's ranch herself on a Friday evening without being approached. Because Clara Kettrick had apparently decided to take her own initiative and talk to her neighbors. Rourke heard the wagon coming and went out to find a small woman in her 60s climbing down from a buckboard with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees weren't what they used to be. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said, surprised. "Clara Kettrick tells me your wife has been explaining things to people," she said. "I'd like things explained to me." She looked toward the house. "In?" Rourke noted the "your wife" and did not correct it, partly because there wasn't a simple correction, and partly because something about the phrase landed somewhere in his chest in a way he wasn't entirely prepared to examine standing in his own yard. "She's in," he said, and opened the door. Lenora spread the full map across the kitchen table for Eleanor Beaumont and walked her through it in the same methodical way she'd walked through it with everyone else, starting with the individual documents, building to the pattern, letting the shape of it emerge from the facts rather than announcing it and then trying to prove it. Eleanor Beaumont sat across from her and listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and asked 3 extremely precise questions at the end that told Lenora the woman had understood every word. "So he's not after the land itself," Eleanor said. "He's after what the land controls." "That's right. And once he has the water, the rest of the valley either buys from him or leaves." "That's my reading of it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the map with an expression that Lenora couldn't immediately categorize. Not fear, not anger, something more complex than either. "My husband built this property over 20 years, she said finally. "He died of a fever 6 years ago. I've been running it alone since then. 3 hands and a foreman who's been with me 15 years. She looked up. "I have a good water situation on the western edge. I'm not in immediate danger." "Not yet," Lenora said carefully. "Not yet," Eleanor agreed. "But if he takes the creek, I'm as trapped as anyone." She reached out and straightened one corner of the map that had curled up. "What is it you're planning to do?" "I'm not ready to say yet. I need to look at a few more things. Are you going to look at them alone?" Lenora looked at her. "No," Eleanor nodded slowly. "Good." She stood up with some effort, both hands on the table. "You need anything from me, you ask. Clara Kettrick speaks well of you. That counts for something." She looked at Rourke, who was standing near the door. "Both of you." She left them with that. It was 2 days later, working through the contracts again, with the full set of 12 ranches documents, that Lenora found it. She almost missed it. She'd been through the contracts 3 times already, checking amounts, dates, signatory information, and had been focusing on the financial provisions. What she caught on the 4th pass was something smaller. Something in the language. She held the Kettrick contract up to the lamp and tilted it at an angle. Then she got up, retrieved the Aldermore contract, and held that one up, too. Then the Greer contract, the Hammond contract. She set them all face up on the table in a row and stood over them for a long moment with her hands on the table. Rourke. He looked up from where he'd been repairing a bridle near the fire. Something in her voice brought him to his feet. She pointed without speaking. He came and looked where she was pointing. In the amendment sections of 4 separate contracts, at the bottom of pages that outlined payment modification terms, there were clauses that had not been present in the versions the ranchers claimed to have signed. Small clauses, 3 to 4 lines each, worded in the kind of dense legal language that made them easy to overlook. That was the point, probably. The kind of provision that wouldn't seem significant until a creditor decided to invoke it. "Those are acceleration clauses," Lenora said. "If the note is sold or transferred, the full balance becomes due immediately rather than on the original schedule." She traced one of the passages. "These weren't in the original contracts. These families didn't sign these versions." Rourke stared at the page. How can you tell? The ink. She held the contract up to the lamp again. Look at the body of the document, the ink color, the weight of the pen. Now look at the amendment section. She angled it so he could see what she was seeing. Different pen, slightly different shade. The amendment was written at a different time than the rest of the document. The room was very quiet. And look here. She pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the amendment page. Frank Kettrick's signature in the main contract versus his signature on the amendment page. She pulled both pages out and laid them side by side. The main signature, see how he makes the K? That loop on the left. She pointed to the amendment signature. On this one, the loop closes differently. It's not dramatically wrong. But it's not the same hand. Rourke was very still. Someone added provisions to these contracts after they were signed, Lenora said, and then re-signed them, or had someone forge the signatures. Yes, the word sat between them. If Calder invokes these clauses, Lenora said carefully, the families who have them in their contracts don't get 60 days. They get a demand for immediate full payment, which none of them can meet. She set the contract down. He could move against 4 properties at once, without warning. When would he do it? When it serves him. Maybe when he thinks people are starting to talk. She looked at Rourke directly. Which means we have less time than we thought. Rourke sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He looked at the documents. He looked at the map. He looked at the lamp, throwing shadows across all of it. We need a lawyer, he said. Yes, Thaddeus Keene is in Cinder Ridge. He's the only territorial attorney within 40 miles. Is he honest? Rourke thought about it seriously. As far as I know, he did the title work on the Beaumont property after her husband died. Eleanor speaks well of him. Eleanor speaks carefully of people, Lenora said. Which means that means something. She began organizing the documents into a careful stack. We go to him tomorrow. Early, Lenora. He looked at her across the table. This is bigger than overcharging. If someone forged signatures on legal contracts. I know what it is, she said quietly. We need to be careful how we move from here. I know that too. She set the last contract on the stack and pressed both hands flat against it. We don't say a word to anyone until we know what Keene thinks. And we don't show anyone these documents until we know how to use what's in them. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes got late at night when the careful, steady outer layer got a little thin, not afraid, not exactly, but fully aware of the weight of what was in front of them. Can you trust him? Keene. Really trust him. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, I think so. Good enough, she said. We go tomorrow. Thaddeus Keene kept an office on Cinder Ridge's Main Street above the Land Records office, which seemed fitting given that half his work involved the records in the room below him. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead and the patient, slightly exhausted manner of a man who spent most of his professional life trying to explain things to people who did not want to understand them. He listened to Lenora for 45 minutes, without interrupting, which was longer than most people lasted. When she finished, he took the contracts she'd arranged on his desk and examined each one under the lamp with the reading glasses, finally in their proper position. He went through them slowly. He had a pen in his hand and made small marks in his own notebook, but said nothing aloud. Rourke sat beside Lenora and watched Keene's face for any readable indication of what he was thinking, and found very little. Finally, the attorney set down the last contract and leaned back in his chair. The ink variance is real, he said. I can see it clearly. He looked at Lenora. You found this how? I've worked with financial documents for 11 years. Paper and ink have characteristics that change over time, and with different instruments. Once you know what to look for, it's not subtle. She paused. To someone who wasn't looking for it, it would be invisible. Keene nodded slowly. The signature discrepancies are more subjective. Court could debate those. He tapped the stack. The ink variance is harder to explain away. And the clauses themselves. He shook his head. These acceleration provisions were not standard to the original instruments. I know the form language for this territory. These were drafted separately and inserted. He looked between them. This is fraud. If what you're describing is accurate, if these additions were made post-signature and with forged ratification, This is document fraud in service of predatory land acquisition. Can it be proven? Rourke asked. With the right documentation and testimony, possibly. Keene paused. But there's another element here that concerns me. He opened his desk drawer and removed a thin folder. Because you're not the first people who have described this pattern to me. Lenora went very still. Approximately 14 months ago, Keene said, I received a letter from a colleague in the Nebraska Territory. He had a client, a rancher, who had experienced something nearly identical. Purchased debt, isolated properties, strategic land surrounding a water source, contract amendments that appeared post facto. He set the folder on the desk. The case didn't go anywhere. The rancher in question couldn't sustain the legal cost and settled on terms he found acceptable enough to stop fighting. He looked at them steadily. The letter exists. And the description of the methodology is close enough to what you've shown me that the same mind was likely behind both. Lenora reached out and touched the folder. May I read it? Keene slid it across the desk. She read it carefully, twice, while both men waited. When she finished, she set it down. He learned from it, she said. Whatever went wrong in Nebraska, why it didn't come together cleanly, he refined the approach. The amendment insertions are more sophisticated here. The acquisition sequence is tighter. She looked at Keene. He's better at this than he was. Yes, Keene said. Which means we need to be better than he expects us to be. They rode back from Cinder Ridge in the early afternoon with the folder of Nebraska correspondence tucked carefully in Lenora's bag, and Rourke's mind working through the implications in the way it did when he was chewing on something he couldn't yet. Resolve quiet and slightly distant, his eyes on the road but not really seeing it. Say what you're thinking, Lenora said. I'm thinking Calder is going to notice eventually that people are talking to each other. The valley's not that big. He probably already suspects it. Which means he might move faster than 60 days. He might. She adjusted her bag against her side. Or he might sit tight because he thinks even if people are talking, they don't have anything that can actually stop him. Which was true 3 days ago. She looked at him. It's less true now. Less isn't the same as not. No, she said. It isn't. They rode in silence for a while. The wind had gone quieter in the afternoon, the kind of still that sometimes came before weather changed. Lenora. He looked at her. What you found those contract alterations. What you did with those families, going through everything one by one, the way you put the whole picture together. He stopped. He was not a man who spoke easily about gratitude, and she knew that about him, and she waited. I couldn't have done that. I would have found Calder's name on the mortgage document and started figuring out how to fight one man instead of seeing the shape of what he was actually doing. She was quiet for a moment. You would have gotten there, she said. Maybe. Eventually, he shook his head, not in 50 days. She looked at the road ahead. That's why it's both of us, she said simply. That's the whole point. He nodded. Didn't say anything more. Didn't need to. They were a mile from the ranch when they heard the horse coming up behind them fast. Rourke turned in the saddle and felt his jaw tighten. The rider was one of Calder's men. He recognized the gray horse, had seen it tied outside Calder's office in Cinder Ridge twice. The man reined in beside them with the easy confidence of someone delivering a message he'd been told not to worry about. Mr. Calder asks if he could have a word with Mr. Varden, the man said. This evening, at the Cinder Ridge Hotel. Rourke looked at the man steadily. Tell him I'm busy. The rider's expression flickered. Mr. Calder said to tell you it's a private offer. Something he'd prefer to discuss before things get further along. Further along, Rourke repeated his words. Lenora said, from beside him, with perfect pleasantness, please tell Mr. Calder that Mr. Varden will be in touch at his convenience. She smiled. Thank you for riding out. The man looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating a situation he'd thought was simple. Then he nodded, turned his horse, and rode back toward Cinder Ridge. They watched him go. He knows we've been talking to people, Rourke said. Yes. He's going to make you an offer tonight whether you show up or not, Lenora said. He's going to put something on a table that's designed to look generous and be a trap. She turned her horse toward the ranch. I want to know what it is before you hear it. Rourke kept pace beside her. You want me to go? I want us to be ready for whatever he offers before he offers it. She was already working through something in her mind. He could see it in the set of her shoulders. What is the one thing he could offer you tonight that might make you consider it? Rourke thought about it honestly. Full debt relief. Something that erases everything immediately. And if he offers that? He was quiet. Rourke. It would be hard to say no to, he said. I know it would. She looked at him directly, which is exactly why he's going to offer it. She held his gaze. I need you to hear it with me in the room and not answer until we've both thought about what it costs. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light caught the side of her face, still a little travel-worn even after 3 weeks. Probably always going to look slightly like someone who had just arrived from somewhere and was already halfway thinking about the next problem. You think I'll fold, he said. I think it will be a very well-constructed offer, she said carefully, and that it will arrive at a moment when you're tired and the weight of other families' problems is sitting on your shoulders alongside your own. She paused. I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm telling you that 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and I'd like mine to be in the room. It wasn't quite an answer to what he'd said. It was a more honest answer than a direct denial would have been. You go with me, he said, if you're willing. You go with me, he said again, settled, and touched his heels to his horse. Vaughn Calder was waiting in the hotel's small private dining room when they arrived, and the expression that crossed his face when Lenora walked in behind Rourke was only there for half a second before he controlled it. But half a second was enough. He hadn't expected her. He was a well-made man, late 40s, broad through the shoulders, with the groomed, expensive look of someone who spent real money on appearing casually prosperous. He stood when they entered and extended his hand to Rourke, with the practiced ease of a man who was always comfortable in a room, and then turned to Lenora with something that was trying very hard to be courteous. I don't believe we've been introduced, he said. Lenora Varden, she said, extending her hand with the same pleasant steadiness she'd used on Garrick Sloane. Rourke's partner. Calder's handshake was brief. I'd hoped this might be a private conversation. It is, Lenora said, and sat down at the table. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to establish something about the evening's dynamic. Then Calder sat back down, and Rourke sat beside Lenora, and the 3 of them looked at each other across the small table, with its hotel china and its lamp that wasn't quite bright enough. Calder leaned forward with his elbows on the table. He looked at Rourke. He was, Lenora noted, making a deliberate choice not to look at her, as though she might become less present if he declined to acknowledge her. I want to make this simple, Calder said. The mortgage on your property is worth $412 to me on paper. I'm prepared to call it settled in full if you'll agree to a land sale. 40 acres, the creek passage, and the outbuildings. I'll pay market value plus 10%. He named a figure that was, Lenora calculated instantly, roughly what the property had been worth before the bad winters. You walk away clean. No debt. Cash in hand. Enough to start again somewhere with better footing. Rourke looked at the table for a moment. Lenora did not look at Rourke. She looked at Calder. What's your timeline on that offer? She asked. Calder looked at her for the first time since they'd sat down. I'd like an answer within the week. And if we need more time to consider it? Something shifted in his face, just slightly. The mortgage deadline doesn't change. Of course not, she said, with the same pleasantness she used like a tool. Presumably a private sale negotiation would have its own timeline. She tilted her head. Unless you'd prefer to work within the 60 days. I'm trying to make this easy, Calder said. His voice hadn't changed, but there was something harder behind it now. I understand that, Lenora said. We appreciate you coming to us directly. She glanced at Rourke a look that said, your turn, and folded her hands on the table. Rourke looked at Calder. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Lenora watched him make a decision, and it was the right one. I need to talk it over with my partner, Rourke said. Calder's eyes moved between them. I don't make decisions about this ranch without her, Rourke said. I'll be in touch. He stood. Lenora stood beside him. Picked up her bag. Calder remained seated. He looked up at them from the table, and there was something in his face now that was less smooth than it had been. When they walked in, not anger exactly, but the look of a man who had done the calculation twice and gotten an unexpected result both times. Mr. Varden, he said, This is a reasonable offer. I heard it, Rourke said. I'll be in touch. They walked out of the hotel into the Wyoming evening, and the cold air hit them both, and they walked to their horses without speaking. Lenora untied her reins. She stood for a moment with her hand on the horse's neck, looking at nothing in particular. He's going to move faster now, she said. I know. He didn't like that you wouldn't answer without me. No, Rourke said. He didn't. She swung up into the saddle. We need Keene, she said, and we need the other families. And we need to do this before he decides that waiting isn't in his interest anymore. How many days do we have? She looked at the dark main street of Cinder Ridge, the lamplight from the hotel window behind them, the wide Wyoming dark beyond the buildings. Not as many as we thought, she said, but enough. If we move now. She turned her horse toward the road home, and Rourke rode beside her, and behind them the hotel window stayed lit for a long time. They were back at the ranch by 9 o'clock, and Lenora went straight to the kitchen table without taking off her coat. Rourke built up the fire while she spread the documents out again, not the map this time, but the contracts, the four, with the altered amendments laid in a separate row from the others. She stood over them, with her coat still on, and her arms crossed, and the expression he'd come to recognize as the one she wore when she was sorting through something that had multiple moving parts and needed to be arranged in the right order before she could act on any of it. He offered fair market value plus 10%, she said. It's not generosity. That's calculation. How do you mean? If he wanted to simply foreclose, he'd wait out the 60 days and pay you nothing beyond what satisfies the mortgage. She finally took off her coat and draped it over a chair. The fact that he's offering above market means he wants this done quietly and quickly. He doesn't want a public proceeding. He doesn't want people comparing notes in a courtroom. She looked at him. He's offering you money to make this problem go away before it becomes a problem he can't manage. Rourke sat down, which means he's more worried than he looked tonight. He was always worried. He just hid it well. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. His man came to find us this afternoon, which means he's been watching. He knows we've been talking to neighbors. He doesn't know what we found yet, but he can see the shape of what we're building even without knowing the details, and it bothers him enough to make a move. So what do we do with that? We use it. She leaned forward on the table. He needs this to stay private. We need it to be exactly the opposite. She paused. I want to bring the families together, all of them, in one room, before he can move against anyone individually. I want them to see the whole picture at the same time, the pattern, the altered contracts, the Nebraska correspondence, so that no individual family is making a decision in isolation. He'll know something's happening. By the time he knows, it'll be too late to stop it. She looked at him steadily. Will the families come? If you ask them. He thought about it honestly. Some of them, yes. Without hesitation, the Kettricks, the Beaumonts, Eleanor Beaumont specifically. Some would be harder. Pete Aldermore had shown up for his own conversation, but a group meeting was different. A group meeting meant committing publicly, meant being seen standing with neighbors against a man who still held their debts. Some of them, he said, the ones who are scared enough. What about the ones who aren't scared enough yet? I'll have to scare them, he said. She looked at him for a moment with something that was almost a smile. Not quite. Can you do that without lying to them? The truth is frightening enough, Rourke said. I don't need to embellish it. Then we have a week. She turned to the contracts. I need to go back to Keene tomorrow. The Nebraska letter is important, but it's circumstantial, without a formal legal opinion connecting it to what we have here. I need him to write something that documents the pattern in language that holds up. She was already organizing papers into 2 stacks, the 4 altered contracts in one pile, the remaining 8 in another. And I need you to ride to every one of those 12 families personally. Don't send a letter. Don't send a message through someone else. Go yourself. Tell them we need to meet. Where? She thought about it. Not in town. Calder has eyes in town. His man found us on the road today, which means he either followed us from Cinder Ridge or he has someone watching our movements. She looked around the kitchen for a moment. Here, in this room. Rourke looked at his kitchen. It was not a large room. It'll be crowded, he said. Good, she said. Crowded means everyone can hear the same words at the same time. No version traveling through 3 people and coming out wrong at the other end. He nodded slowly. 7 days. They sat with that for a moment, the lamp between them and the fire behind them, and the wind picking up outside the way it did most nights this time of year, working at the eaves of the cabin like something trying to get in. Rourke. She had a specific tone when she was about to say something she'd been turning over for a while. He'd learned to listen more carefully when she used it. Tonight, at the hotel when he made that offer, what did you feel? He was quiet. She waited him out, because she knew by now that he needed that space, or he'd say the first surface thing instead of the real one. Relief, he said finally, for about 3 seconds. And then I thought about the Kettricks. He looked at the table. About Clara Kettrick's face when you showed her what Calder had done. About Pete Aldermore standing in his own gate like a man defending something he shouldn't have to defend. He paused. The offer would have solved my problem. It wouldn't have solved theirs. Quiet for a moment. You know that's exactly right. Doesn't make it easier. No, she said, it doesn't. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment, just a moment, quick and practical the way she did things, and then pulled it back and went back to the contracts. Get some sleep, she said. You ride tomorrow. He rode for 4 days. Not all 12 families were easy. The Greer family, Silas Greer and his 2 sons, who ran the largest single operation in the valley, after Eleanor Beaumont were skeptical in the particular wave of people who had managed to stay above the worst of the financial trouble and therefore hadn't fully internalized that their position was not as secure as it felt. I don't owe Calder anything, Silas said, standing on his porch with his arms in the same configuration Pete Aldermore had used, which appeared to be a standard posture for valley men receiving unwelcome information. My note is still with the Cheyenne Bank. As far as you know, Rourke said. Do you have written confirmation that it hasn't been transferred? Silas stared at him. Banks don't just sell loans without telling people. Calder's transactions don't appear on public records until after the fact. The First Territorial sold 3 notes without prior notification to the borrowers. Rourke kept his voice level. I'm not saying your situation is the same. I'm saying we don't know that it isn't. And if it is, and you're not in that room next Thursday, you'll be making a decision in the dark. Silas's older son, who was about 25 and had been leaning against the porch rail with his hat pushed back, said, What happens if you're right and we don't come? Calder moves against the properties he has leverage on, one at a time, fast enough that nobody can organize a response. Rourke looked at the son and then back at Silas. A third of this valley's water disappears into his control within 30 days. The rest of you spend the next 2 years finding out what it costs to water your cattle through a man who doesn't have any particular interest in making it affordable. There was a long silence. Thursday, Silas said. What time? Lenora, meanwhile, had her own difficult conversation. She went to Thaddeus Keene's office alone on the 2nd day, while Rourke was riding to the northern ranch families, and she laid out what she needed from him with the precision she brought to all requests that required something from someone who might be reluctant to provide it. I need a formal written opinion, she told him, documenting the contract alterations, connecting the methodology to the Nebraska case, and outlining the potential legal exposure for whoever executed the fraud. She paused. I also need you to represent all 12 families collectively if this goes to a formal proceeding. Keene took off his reading glasses. That's a significant commitment. I know it is. Collectively representing 12 separate parties in a fraud and predatory land acquisition case against a man with Calder's resources. He set the glasses on his desk. He'll have attorneys from Laramie or Cheyenne, possibly both. This could take months. It will certainly cost money these families don't have. Then we structure your fee against the outcome, Lenora said. If we succeed, you receive payment from the restitution. If we don't, she paused, I'll personally guarantee a base fee from whatever Rourke and I have left. Keene looked at her for a long moment. You understand what you're offering. Yes. If this fails, you'd be taking on a personal debt on top of everything else. I'm aware, she met his eyes. Is the case sound, mister? Keene, what I've brought you, is it enough? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents on his desk. He looked at the Nebraska folder. The ink evidence on the contract alterations is strong, he said slowly. The signature discrepancies are supportable with a handwriting analysis, which I can arrange through a colleague in Cheyenne. The Nebraska case establishes a pattern that a reasonable court would consider significant. He picked up his pen and turned it over in his fingers. It's not a guaranteed outcome, there's no such thing. But it's a real case, he looked at her. Yes, I'll do it. She released a breath she hadn't entirely been aware she was holding. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said, and started writing. On the third day, a letter arrived at the ranch. It was addressed to Rourke, but he was out riding, and Lenora opened it because she'd been opening his correspondence for 2 weeks now, and they'd reached the kind of practical understanding about such things that didn't require explicit discussion. It was from Calder's office. 2 paragraphs, formal language, the surface temperature of something polite. The second paragraph contained a deadline, not the mortgage deadline that was still 38 days out. A new one, 7 days from the letter's date, which had been written 3 days ago, which meant Calder wanted an answer to his private offer in 4 days. Lenora read the letter twice. Then she set it flat on the table and walked to the window and stood there for a moment. He was accelerating. She'd said he would. She'd been right that the hotel meeting had made him nervous. But nervous men with resources were more dangerous than confident men with resources. And what she felt in that moment, looking out the window at the Wyoming afternoon, was not fear exactly, but the specific cold clarity of understanding that the margin had just gotten smaller. She picked up the letter and put it in her bag. When Rourke came back that evening, she handed it to him without preamble. He read it. His jaw tightened. That was the only exterior sign, and then he set it on the table. 4 days, he said. We have the meeting in 5. I know. If he doesn't have an answer from you in 4 days, he moves to his next option. She sat down, which is probably invoking those acceleration clauses and initiating immediate proceedings against the 4 families whose contracts were altered. That gives him a legal action in progress before our meeting even happens. Can he do that? Invoke clauses that were fraudulently inserted. Can try. It would get tangled in legal proceedings, which is eventually where we want it. But if he files first, he controls the narrative of how the story gets told publicly. She pressed her hand flat on the table. We need the meeting to happen before he files anything. That means moving it up. By 2 days, she looked at him. Can you reach everyone? He thought about the roads, the distances, the families he'd already spoken to, and the 2 he hadn't reached yet. He thought about Silas Greer's son leaning on the porch rail with his hat pushed back. He thought about Eleanor Beaumont climbing carefully down from her buckboard. I can try, he said, Rourke. I can do it, he said, correcting himself. I'll do it, she nodded. Good. Then we need to talk about how we run this meeting. Because walking 12 ranch families through the full picture of what Calder has done is not the same as walking one family through it. 12 people in a room have 12 different fears and 12 different reasons to want a different outcome. Some of them don't like each other, he said. I know. You told me. The Kettrick-Hammond fence dispute. Aldermore and Greer. She opened her notebook. Which is why the order we present things matters. We don't start with what unites them. We start with what each of them is facing individually, their specific situation, their specific documents. We let each person see their own name in the story first. By the time we pull back to the full pattern, they'll already understand that their private problem isn't private. She looked up. Does that make sense? It makes sense. It'll still be a difficult room. Yes, she said, it will. She paused. I'll need you to hold the room if it gets heated. People know you. They trust you in the way of people who've watched someone work hard for a long time. That matters more than anything I can do in there. He looked at her. You want me to be the face of this. I want you to be you, she said, which is not the same thing as being a face. She closed her notebook. I'll handle the documents and the legal logic. I need you to handle the people. It was, he thought, a very accurate division of their respective strengths, and it had taken her approximately 3 weeks to identify it precisely. He was still not sure whether that was impressive or slightly unnerving. 3 days, he said. 3 days. He went to get his coat. He reached the last family, the Beaumont Ranch. which was farthest west on the following evening as the light was failing, and Eleanor met him at the door before he dismounted. Told him either someone had ridden ahead or the woman simply had a reliable instinct for arrivals. 2 days sooner, she said when he'd explained. It wasn't a question. Tuesday evening. Our place. She looked at him for a moment. She had the kind of face that had kept its own counsel for a long time, and the expression on it now was one he couldn't fully read. Is the girl ready for this? Eleanor asked. He didn't correct the girl, partly because Eleanor was in her 60s, and everyone under 50 was probably a girl to her, and partly because he understood what she was actually asking. Yes, he said. More than ready. Eleanor studied him. And you? Last time I saw you, you were a man who'd spent a long time carrying things by himself. You look different now. He hadn't expected that. He stood with his horse in the falling light and thought about it honestly, because Eleanor was the kind of person who deserved an honest answer. I feel different, he said. She nodded once, like something had been confirmed. Tuesday, she said, and went back inside. The meeting was on Tuesday at 7 in the evening, and by 6:45, Rourke's kitchen contained 17 people and was producing a quantity of body heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace. 12 ranch families meant, in practice, 12 adults and a shifting number of additional family members' grown sons, daughters in their late teens, a wife here, a brother there. Lenora had anticipated up to 20 people and had arranged the room accordingly, pushing all furniture to the walls except the kitchen table, which she'd placed at the end of the room near the fireplace, with the documents and the map arranged on its surface. People filled in around her, some sitting on the pushed-back chairs and bench, most standing, the smell of horses and cold outdoor air, and several different suppers, mixing into something that was distinctly a crowd. The tension was also distinctly a crowd. Aldermore and Greer managed to stand on opposite sides of the room with the natural precision of people who had been doing that for years. 2 of the Kettrick sons looked at 2 of the Hammond sons in a way that communicated something that predated tonight's agenda by at least 3 years. It was the particular social atmosphere of people who were used to being neighbors in the way that meant sharing a territory, not in the way that meant trusting each other. Lenora let it sit for a moment. She stood at the table and waited for the noise to settle to a level where a voice didn't have to compete with it. And then she said, clearly and without preamble, "Thank you for coming. I know some of you had to make an effort to be here tonight, and I'm not going to waste your time." She looked around the room. "I'm also not going to tell you what to think about what you're about to see. I'm going to show you documents. You can draw your own conclusions." She started with the Kettricks because they were the family who'd seen this coming longest and whose composure would anchor the room. She walked Frank and Clara through the basic structure of their mortgage transfer out loud in front of everyone and watched the faces around the room shift as people recognized the shape of a situation they'd assumed was specific to them. She moved to the Aldermores, then the Hammonds. She didn't rush. She'd learned from 11 individual conversations that people needed to hear their own name in this before they could hear anyone else's, and she honored that even now, even 17 people in the room and the clock moving. When she'd covered 8 families, she picked up the map. "This is Blackwillow Creek," she said, and laid it flat on the table. She waited for people to come closer. They did, crowding around the table in the uncoordinated way of people who'd lost track of who they were avoiding for the sake of seeing something, and then she began pointing. "Rourke's 40 acres sit here, Kettrick land here, Aldermore here, the Hammond property at this confluence point." Her finger moved around the creek's branches. "When you look at which properties Von Calder now holds debt against, you can see a pattern. He has not bought randomly. He has bought specifically. Properties he holds, taken together, give him control of every major water source in this valley." The room was very quiet. "If he forecloses on the 4 properties with the earliest deadlines," she continued, "the remaining families lose reliable water access during drought season, which puts each of you in the position of either selling your land on whatever terms he decides to offer, or trying to operate without the water you've depended on." She let that land. "He's been building this for at least 8 months," she said. "Possibly longer. He waited for the bad winters to put families on margin, purchased debts from banks at reduced prices, and position himself to move against multiple properties in a sequence designed to prevent anyone from organizing a coordinated response. She looked around the room. What he did not plan for is that you are all in this room at the same time. Several people started talking at once. Rourke, who had been standing near the door because he understood his role tonight, raised his voice just enough to cut through the noise. Let her finish. The room quieted. He hadn't raised it by much. It was enough. There's one more thing, Lenora said. She picked up the 4 altered contracts and held them up. These are the mortgage documents for the Kettrick, Aldermore, Hammond, and Whaley properties. I'd like you to look at them carefully. She moved around the table and let people handle the documents, watching the moment on each face when they saw what she was showing them: the amendment pages, the ink variants, the signature discrepancies. She watched Frank Kettrick hold his own contract up to the lamp and examine the ink the way she'd shown him, and watched his expression close in on something cold and still. These amendments were not in the contracts when these families signed them, she said. The additional provisions were inserted afterward. And the signatures ratifying those amendments are not consistent with the signatures on the original documents. She let that be what it was. The woman saying someone forged our papers, Silas Greer said from across the room. He wasn't asking. I'm saying the physical evidence of these documents suggests that the amendments were added after the original signatures were obtained, Lenora said carefully. Territorial court and a handwriting analysis can make the legal determination. I'm telling you what I see. That's forgery, Silas said. Appears to be. The room erupted. Rourke let it go for about 30 seconds. People needed the release of it, needed to hear their own outrage out loud, and then put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a whistle, sharp enough to stop a horse at 100 yards. It stopped 17 humans at 12 feet, one at a time, he said. What followed was 40 minutes of the most difficult conversation Rourke Varden had ever facilitated, which was saying something for a man who had spent 11 years negotiating with cattle, weather, his own stubbornness. People talked over each other and then apologized, and then talked over each other again. The Kettrick boys and the Hammond boys had a moment that required Rourke's physical presence between them, which he provided without comment, and with the particular calm of a man who had spent enough time around explosive situations to know that escalating the energy in one never helped. Pete Aldermore said at one point that he didn't see why his situation had anything to do with the Greer family situation, and he'd rather handle his own affairs. Your affairs stopped being your own when someone forged your signature, Clara Kettrick said, from across the room, with a precision that ended that particular line of argument. Silas Greer, to his credit, looked at the floor and said nothing. Eleanor Beaumont said very little for the first half of the meeting. She sat in the chair that Rourke had positioned near the table, specifically because he'd noticed her knees were bothering her tonight. And she watched and listened with the focused patience of someone who had decided that forming an opinion before all the information was in was a waste of a perfectly good opinion. When the room had argued itself to a temporary quieter place, she said, "What exactly are you proposing we do?" Lenora looked at her. Present called her with a unified position before he can file any individual proceedings. With Thaddeus Keene representing all 12 families collectively, with the altered contracts and the Nebraska evidence formally documented, and with 12 families standing together rather than 12 private disasters happening in sequence, she paused. He's scheduled to receive a response from Rourke on his private offer in 3 days. Instead of a private answer, we give him a public one. A public proceeding, Eleanor said, if he forces it. What I expect he'll do when he sees what we have is negotiate. Lenora looked around the room. He's not foolish. He knows what forged contracts mean to his credibility and his legal standing. He has other operations, other territory interests. He doesn't want a fraud case following him to the next county. And if he's more stubborn than you expect? Silas Greer asked. Then Thaddeus Keene files in territorial court and we make it public regardless. She looked at him steadily. Either way, he loses this valley. The question is whether we do it quickly and cleanly or at length and at cost. The room was quiet again, but differently, not the charged quiet of people about to argue, but the heavy quiet of people making decisions. I'm in, Frank Kettrick said. We're in, Clara corrected, which earned a very small sound from somewhere that might have been a laugh. One by one, the others said yes, some quickly, some slowly. Aldermore was third to last and looked like the word cost him something, but he said it. The final holdout was a younger rancher named Beaufort Whaley, whose family held one of the altered contracts, and he stood in the corner of the room with his hat in his hands for a long moment while everyone waited. "If this goes wrong," he said, "Calder calls our debt immediately and we lose everything." "If you do nothing," Rourke said, "from near the door, he calls your debt on the forged terms, and you lose everything faster." Whaley looked at his hat, then at Rourke, then at Lenora. "Fine," he said. They stayed until nearly 10 o'clock, working through the practical details, with Keene's written opinion as the framework. Who would sign what timeline they were working toward, how communication between the families would be handled without going through Cinder Ridge's main channels, where Calder's people might intercept something. It was painstaking and occasionally contentious, and at one point involved a 15-minute argument about a fence line that had exactly nothing to do with the matter at hand and had to be physically interrupted by Lenora saying, flatly, "Gentlemen, the fence can wait. Calder cannot." When people finally started leaving, filing out into the Wyoming night in 2s and 3s, Eleanor Beaumont was the last to go. She stood near the door while Rourke held it open, and she looked at Lenora, who was reorganizing the documents at the table with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to have something to do with her hands. "You did well tonight," Eleanor said. Lenora looked up. "They did well. I just arranged things so they could see clearly." Eleanor studied her for a moment. "That's what good work usually is," she said, and walked out into the night. Rourke closed the door and leaned against it. The kitchen looked like a room where 17 people had been standing for 3 hours, which it was. The map was still on the table. The lamp was burning lower. "We have 3 days until Calder expects an answer," Rourke said. "2," Lenora corrected. "I want to be in front of him before his deadline, not on the day of it. Arriving on the day makes it look like we barely managed. Arriving a day early makes it look like we weren't worried." She set the last document on the stack. "Which is approximately true. Approximately. I'm a little worried," she said, with the specific honesty she deployed at the end of difficult days when the careful outer layer had genuinely worn through. "I want you to know that. I think what we have is enough. I think he'll negotiate rather than fight. But I've also been wrong before, and it's possible I'm missing something." Rourke pushed off from the door and came to the table. He didn't try to tell her she wasn't missing anything. He didn't try to tell her it was going to be fine. He sat down across from her the way he had weeks ago, when she'd first spread 12 families' documents across his floor, and he looked at the map between them. "We've done everything right that we could do," he said. "The rest is him." She looked at the map for a moment, then at him. "Yes," she said, "it is." The next morning, Calder's rider came before Rourke had finished breakfast. The man knocked this time, which was a change. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and delivered a message in the tone of someone who understood he was carrying news that was going to be received badly. Calder had moved up his own timeline. He was requesting Rourke's answer by end of day, not in 3 days. He was prepared to extend his offer until sunset. After sunset, the letter said, he would pursue other remedies. Lenora read the letter at the table, while Rourke stood in the doorway watching her face. She read it once, then she set it down. Then, to his considerable surprise, she said, "Good." Stared at her. "Good? He's frightened." She stood up from the table. Someone talked. Someone from last night told someone who has a connection to Calder's office, and now he knows the meeting happened, and he's trying to force a private resolution before we can implement anything we planned. She looked at Rourke with the expression of someone who had just had a calculation confirm itself, which means we skip the private conversation entirely. "Lenora, we go to Keene this morning. We tell him to send Calder formal notifications that 12 ranch families are represented collectively, that we have evidence of document fraud, and that we are prepared to bring the matter to the territorial court." She picked up her coat. "We put it in front of him officially before sunset. Not as an answer to his offer, as a statement of position." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "That's a large swing." "Yes." She met his eyes. "Are you with me?" He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at the map that had been there for 3 weeks, worn soft at the fold lines from all the times she'd opened and closed it. He thought about the Kettricks and the Aldermores and Eleanor Beaumont's careful approval, and Beaufort Whaley looking at his hat, and finally saying fine, because the alternative was worse. He thought about 41 letters, and a green traveling dress, and a woman who had arrived in this valley carrying one suitcase, a handful of books, and a set of skills she'd spent 11 years applying to problems that didn't deserve them. "I'm with you," he said. She put on her coat. "Then let's go," she said. "We have until sunset." She walked out the door and he followed, and behind them the kitchen table held the map and the contracts and the letter and everything they'd built over 5 weeks of hard, careful work. And outside the Wyoming morning was cold and clear and moving fast, the way it always did out here, the way it always had, unimpressed by anyone's timeline and completely indifferent to whether you were ready. They went anyway. Keene read Calder's letter standing up, which told Rourke something about the attorney's assessment of it. A man sits down with a problem he needs to think about and stays on his feet with one he's already decided how to handle. "He's bluffing on the timeline," Keene said. "End of day is not a legally meaningful deadline for a private offer. Can't accelerate the mortgage proceedings. On this basis, the original instrument has 31 days remaining, and a private letter doesn't alter that." He set the letter on his desk. "What he can do is file on the 4 altered contracts, invoke the acceleration clauses, and initiate proceedings before we can get anything formal in front of a court." "Which is what we're trying to prevent," Lenora said. "Which is what we're trying to prevent," Keene agreed. He looked at her steadily. "If I send him formal notification of collective representation and the fraud evidence this morning, he has 2 options. He responds through his own attorney and we move toward a formal proceeding, or he contacts us privately and we negotiate." He picked up his pen. "Either way, his leverage on the individual families collapses the moment he knows they're not individual anymore." "How long to draft the notification?" "An hour." He was already pulling paper from his drawer. "I'll send it by midday rider." Lenora sat down in the chair across from his desk. Rourke remained standing near the window. Outside, Cinder Ridge was going about its Tuesday morning business with no particular awareness that something was being set in motion in the office above the records room that would determine what the valley looked like in 30 years. "There's one more thing," Lenora said. Keene looked up. "The meeting last night, someone talked. Calder knows it happened, which means he has a source inside the group, or close enough to it to have heard." She folded her hands in her lap. "I don't know who. I'm not asking you to find out. But it means he's going to know about the formal notification before his rider delivers it, and he'll have time to prepare his response." "That's not necessarily a problem," Keene said slowly. "It isn't," she agreed, "because what he'll prepare is a negotiating position, not a legal offense. The moment he starts preparing to negotiate, he's conceded that a fight isn't in his interest." She looked at the attorney. "I want to be in that room when he responds, whichever room it is." Keene set down his pen. "He won't like that." He didn't like it at the hotel either. She met Keene's eyes. "He'll manage." The writer left Keene's office at 11:45 with a sealed letter addressed to Vaughn Calder at the Cinder Ridge Hotel, where he'd been staying for the past week, which itself told a story, Lenora had noted, about a man who'd expected this matter to resolve quickly and had positioned himself accordingly. She and Rourke went back to the ranch and waited. Waiting was, in her experience, one of the more difficult professional skills, and she was not naturally gifted at it. She reorganized the documents twice. She wrote 3 pages of notes in her notebook about the sequence of the formal proceeding. If it came to that, the order in which the evidence should be presented, the questions Calder's attorney would likely raise, the answers those questions had. She made coffee and let it go cold and made more. Rourke, across the room, repaired 2 pieces of tack that probably could have waited, checked on the horses twice, and at one point stood in the doorway, looking at the sky for several minutes, in the particular way of men who'd spent enough years reading weather that they did it automatically, even when weather wasn't the problem. "He'll respond today," Lenora said, without looking up from her notes. "Think so. He doesn't have a choice. If he ignores it, we control the timeline." "He won't ignore it." She turned a page. "The question is whether he comes himself or sends his attorney." What does it mean if he sends the attorney? It means he's decided on a hard negotiation and wants distance between himself and the initial position. She finally looked up. If he comes himself, it means he's decided on a quick resolution and wants to control it personally. Rourke considered this. Which do you want? Him, she said. Personally. His attorney will have been told what he can and cannot concede. Calder himself might be moved by the full picture in a way a hired attorney won't be. Or he'll be angrier. Possibly. She went back to her notes. That's a risk. The writer came at 3 in the afternoon. Not Calder's usual gray horse man, a different one. Younger, who delivered a sealed envelope with the neutral expression of someone who had been told specifically not to have an expression. The note inside was brief. Calder would meet with Thaddeus Keene and the party's representatives at the Cinder Ridge Meeting Hall at 10 o'clock the following morning. He would bring his attorney. Lenora read it and handed it to Rourke. He's bringing his attorney, Rourke said. Yes, she was already putting on her coat. Which means we bring everyone. She spent that evening writing to 6 ranch families personally. Rourke took the other 6. They split the valley between them the way they'd split most of the logistical work over the past 5 weeks, without lengthy discussion, based on a mutual understanding of who could cover which ground fastest and who had the existing relationship to make the message land cleanly. The message was simple. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Cinder Ridge Meeting Hall, be there. Most of the families said yes immediately. The Kettricks said yes before she'd finished the sentence. Eleanor Beaumont said yes and then said, he blinked first, didn't he? Which was not a question. He requested the meeting, Lenora said carefully. What I said, Eleanor replied, and went inside to tell her foreman to have the wagon ready at 8. The one difficult stop was Beaufort Whaley, who opened the door looking like a man who hadn't slept the previous night and had spent the waking hours convincing himself that everything was about to go wrong. If we go to that meeting and it falls apart, Whaley said, he files on our contract the same day. We've got one of the altered ones. He invokes that acceleration clause and we're done. We don't have the money to fight a court proceeding. I know, Lenora said. That's true. He stared at her. He'd clearly expected her to argue. So you're saying it's a real risk? Yes, it's a real risk. She stood on his porch in the cold and didn't soften it. What's also true is that the acceleration clause in your contract was fraudulently inserted, which means invoking it opens Calder to a fraud charge that damages his standing in this territory and every other one where he does business. His attorney knows that. Calder knows that. She looked at Whaley steadily. He's not going to file on your contract tomorrow. It would cost him more than he'd gain. You can't be certain of that. No, she said. I can't be certain. I can tell you that everything about how he's operated suggests he prefers profitable resolution to expensive fights, and that the evidence we have makes fighting very expensive for him. She paused. But you have to make your own decision. If you don't come, I understand it. I won't think less of you. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the gap between his barn and his house with a low sustained sound that was very nearly a word. My father built this place, he said finally. He broke his back doing it. Literal broke his back in a fence post accident in 1871 and walked crooked for the rest of his life and kept working anyway. He looked out at the dark yard. I can't be the one who loses it. Then come tomorrow, Lenora said. And trust that 12 people standing together are harder to move than one. He looked at her for a moment longer. 8 o'clock, he said. I'll be there. The Cinder Ridge Meeting Hall was the largest indoor space in the town, used for everything from seasonal dances to territorial dispute hearings and, on one notorious occasion in 1882, as a temporary shelter for 40 displaced cattle during a blizzard, which the building had never quite recovered from, in terms of reputation. It had long wooden benches arranged in rows, a raised area at the front that served as a speaking platform, and windows along both sides that in October let in a flat cold light that illuminated everything, without warming anything. By 9:45, every bench was full. Word had traveled beyond the 12 ranch families, the way word always traveled in a small territory. People from town had come the blacksmith, 2 of the shopkeepers, a woman who ran the boarding house and had no particular stake in the water rights dispute, but had an informed interest in the economic health of the valley's ranching families who were her primary customers. They sat toward the back with the attentive neutrality of people who had come to watch something important happen. Rourke stood near the side wall and counted faces. He found all 12 families. He found Eleanor Beaumont in the front row with her foreman, sitting with the composed posture of someone attending something she had fully intended to attend. He found Beauford Whaley near the back, with his wife and his oldest son, the three of them sitting close together in the way of people who were nervous and taking comfort in physical proximity. He found Lenora at the front of the room beside the speaking platform, talking quietly with Thaddeus Keene, who had a leather satchel that Rourke knew contained the full documentation, the altered contracts, the ink analysis, the signature comparison, the Nebraska correspondence, and the formal written opinion Keene had completed the previous evening. She was wearing her good dress, the dark one she'd worn twice since arriving once to church, which she'd attended once out of social courtesy and not repeated, and once to the dinner with the Kettricks when they'd finalized the agreement for her to represent their financial interests. It was not a fancy dress. It was a dress that said, "I take this seriously," which was exactly what it needed to say. Calder walked in at 3 minutes to 10. He came with two men, his attorney, a broad-faced man from Cheyenne named Hartley, who carried his own leather satchel and surveyed the room with the professional assessment of someone calculating disadvantage, and a second man Rourke didn't recognize, who positioned himself near the door with the specific body language of someone whose job was to be near the door. Calder himself walked to the front of the room and looked at the assembled families and the full benches beyond them, and something moved across his face that he controlled before it became fully visible. He had not expected this many people. He looked at Lenora. She met his eyes without any particular expression and indicated the chair on the opposite side of the table from where she and Keene were standing. Calder sat. His attorney sat beside him. Rourke came forward and stood to Lenora's left. "Mr. Calder," Keene said, "thank you for agreeing to meet." "I wasn't given much option," Calder said. His voice was level. He was not a man who lost his composure easily, and he wasn't losing it now, but there was a tightness to his courtesy that hadn't been there in the hotel dining room. "You had options," Keene said, with the mild patience of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms like this one. "You chose this one. I think it was the right choice." He opened his satchel. "I'd like to proceed by presenting the evidence we've compiled, which my clients believe demonstrates a pattern of predatory debt acquisition and fraudulent contract modification. After that presentation, I'd like to discuss resolution." He looked at Hartley. "Do you have any procedural objections before we begin?" Hartley leaned toward Calder and said something quiet. Calder listened and then said, "Go ahead." Keene nodded and looked at Lenora. She stood up and spread the map on the table between them. She started where she always started, with the individual pieces, specific and documented, before the full picture. She walked through the debt acquisition sequence, property by property, with dates and amounts and the names of the banks from which Calder's office had purchased the notes. She did it without theater, without accusation in her tone, in the methodical voice of a person reading from a ledger, because that was, in fact, what she was doing. The room was quiet enough that the paper made a sound when she turned each page. Calder's attorney took notes. Calder himself watched her with the focused attention of a man trying to find the place where her logic had a gap. He was looking for a while. When she reached the map and traced the geographic pattern of acquisitions around Blackwillow Creek, she heard the room shift behind her, not a sound exactly. More a change in the quality of the silence. Kind that happens when 40 people simultaneously understand something they'd only partially understood before. "The properties, mister. Calder holds debt against," she said, "when placed on a map of the valley's water sources, reveal a pattern that is not consistent with general investment, but with the specific acquisition of water control." She looked at Calder directly. This was the plan from the beginning. Not ranches. Water. Calder's expression did not change. Hartley said, "Acquiring debts on struggling properties is not illegal. Strategic land investment is not illegal." "No," Lenora agreed. "It isn't." She turned to the second set of documents. "This is." She laid out the 4 altered contracts. She walked through the ink variants with the same precision she'd used with the families in Rourke's kitchen, the different weight, the different shade, visible when the paper was held at the right angle to light. She produced the formal handwriting comparison that Keene's colleague in Cheyenne had completed, which documented the signature discrepancies on the amendment pages in the measured language of professional analysis. She explained what the acceleration clauses would have allowed and when. These provisions were not present in the original contracts, she said. The physical evidence of the documents themselves demonstrates that they were added after the original signatures were obtained. The signatures ratifying these amendments are not consistent with the signatures on the original instruments. She set the papers down. Someone altered these contracts after they were signed, and then signed them again, or had them signed, in a way that was intended to appear like the original parties had ratified the changes. The room behind her was very quiet. Hartley said something to Calder that Rourke couldn't hear. Calder didn't respond visibly. "That's a serious allegation," Hartley said to the room. "It's a documented finding," Keene said pleasantly. "The allegation of who bears responsibility for the alterations, that's a matter for a proceeding to determine." He reached into his satchel and produced the last document. "This is correspondence from a territorial attorney in Nebraska approximately 14 months ago, is describing a methodology strikingly similar to what my clients have experienced here. Debt acquisition, isolated property owners, strategic geographic targeting of water access, contract modifications appearing post-signature." He set it on the table. "We're prepared to present this as evidence of a pattern in any formal proceeding." Hartley picked up the Nebraska letter and read it. His expression, which had been professionally composed to this point, went through a small adjustment that he managed quickly, but not quickly enough. He set it down and said, "I'd like a moment with my client." "Of course," Keene said. Calder and Hartley moved to the far end of the room. They spoke quietly for several minutes. Rourke watched, and so did everyone else in the room, with varying degrees of subtlety. He watched Calder's back. The man had the posture of someone absorbing information he'd hoped not to receive, processing it in real time against whatever calculations he'd walked in with. The Nebraska letter was the thing Rourke could see it in the set of Calder's shoulders, the way they'd changed when Keene produced it. He hadn't known Keene had it. He'd thought the documentation would be limited to what was in this valley, and a case limited to this valley was something he could fight or negotiate around. A case that established a pattern across territories was something different. Eleanor Beaumont, from the front bench, leaned slightly toward the woman beside her and said something very quiet. The woman nodded. Neither of them looked particularly worried. They had the look of people who had made their decision and were now simply waiting for events to confirm it. Calder came back to the table. He sat down. He looked at Keene first, and then at Lenora, and his expression had made a journey since he'd walked in that morning, not broken, not humbled exactly, but recalibrated. Confidence was still there. It was just wearing different clothes. "What are your client's terms?" he said. It was Keene who answered, which was correct, which was exactly how it was supposed to go. And Lenora stood beside the attorney and said nothing, because this was the moment that belonged to the man she'd hired for precisely this. "The fraudulently altered provisions in the 4 affected contracts are voided in their entirety," Keene said. "The original terms are restored. The affected families receive restitution for any payments made on the basis of the altered terms." He turned a page in his notes. "Mr. Varden's mortgage is transferred back to the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne at its original terms, with the 60-day acceleration notice from Calder's office considered null. The same applies to the Kettrick and Aldermore notes." He looked up. "Mr. Calder relinquishes all remaining claims on properties adjacent to Blackwillow Creek." Hartley started to say something. Calder put a hand on the table, not a gesture exactly, more a placement, a deliberate stillness, and Hartley stopped. "All claims," Calder said. Those are the terms," Keene said. "You're asking me to walk away from everything I've invested in this valley over 8 months. I'm asking you to walk away with your legal standing intact," Keene said, with the same mild patience he'd used all morning. "A territorial fraud proceeding, with the Nebraska correspondence as supporting evidence, would follow you to every county where you do business. The documents we have are sufficient to open that proceeding today. He paused. These families aren't asking for damages beyond restitution on the altered terms. They're asking for their land and their water back. That's the entirety of it. Calder looked at the table. He looked at the map, still spread between them. He looked at the Blackwillow Creek that Lenora had sketched in pencil, the main branch and its forks, the properties arranged around it like pieces of something he'd been assembling for the better part of a year. He looked at Lenora. She met his eyes. He looked away first. "Hartley," he said, "write it up." The noise that went through the room when Hartley said agreed was not a cheer exactly. It was something more complicated, the release of a breath that 40 people had been holding at different intensities for different amounts of time. And the particular sounds that came with it were relief and disbelief, and in at least 2 cases, what sounded like crying that the people producing it immediately tried to make sound like coughing. Rourke stood very still for a moment. He'd known they had a strong case. He'd known, on the rational level that Lenora had carefully constructed over 5 weeks, that the evidence was real, and the pattern was documented, and Calder's exposure was genuine. He'd believed it the way you believe something that has been explained to you clearly by someone you trust. He had not fully believed it, the way you believe something in your body, until Hartley said agreed, and Calder stopped fighting. He looked at Lenora. She was making a note in her notebook, with the focused calm of someone who had already moved to the next logistical question. She did not look triumphant. She looked like someone doing her job. He knew her well enough by now to understand that the absence of visible triumph was itself a form of it. Frank Kettrick appeared at his elbow. The older man's eyes were wet, and he was very clearly not going to acknowledge that, and Rourke was not going to acknowledge that he'd noticed. "Your wife," Frank said. And then he stopped, because apparently there wasn't a sentence that completed itself adequately. "I know," Rourke said. "You tell her." Frank put a hand on Rourke's shoulder for a moment, a brief, hard grip, the kind men use when they mean something they don't know how to say, and then moved away toward his wife. Paperwork took 2 hours. It always takes 2 hours in situations like this. There is the agreement in principle, and then there is the agreement in writing, and they are related but not identical. And the gap between them is occupied by attorneys and their careful language and the specific misery of making sure that what you mean and what is written are the same thing. Hartley drafted and Keene reviewed and revised, and there were 3 points of contention that had to be negotiated in the specific lawyerly way that sounded calm and was not. The restitution amount was one of them. Hartley's first figure was too low, and Lenora, who had been sitting quietly making notes, produced her own calculation from her notebook and set it on the table without comment. It was higher than Hartley's number by $63 across the 4 families and was documented line by line. Hartley looked at it. Keene looked at it. Calder from across the table looked at it. "Her number is correct," Calder said to Hartley. Hartley wrote it down. The second contention was the timeline for returning the mortgage instruments to their original lenders. Hartley wanted 30 days. Keene wanted 10. They settled on 15, which was Lenora's suggested compromise from her notebook, which she offered without being asked, and which both attorneys accepted without discussing who had suggested it. The third was the wording around the relinquishment of claims on the creek-adjacent properties. Hartley tried 3 versions of language that preserved some theoretical future option for Calder in the valley. Keene rejected all 3 with the particular gentleness of a man who had very sharp teeth and was choosing not to use them. The 4th version was clean. They all signed at noon. Calder signed without ceremony his name on the document, quick and controlled, the signature of a man who had made his calculation and was executing it without drama. He stood after and buttoned his coat and looked at the room that had watched the entire proceeding with varying degrees of visible satisfaction. He looked at Lenora one more time. "You were thorough," he said. It was the most neutral compliment in existence, and it was the only one he was going to offer. "Thank you," she said, as neutrally. He left with Hartley and the man from the door, and the room watched them go, and then the room exhaled in the full collective way it hadn't been able to while he was still in it. What followed was not a celebration exactly, though it had some of the features. It was the kind of gathering that happens when people who have been frightened together Stop being frightened, a messy overlapping, partially incoherent release of social energy that involved everyone talking at once and several conversations happening in the same physical space without necessarily connecting. Kettricks found the Hammonds, and whatever had been between those two families got quietly buried under the pressure of the moment, in a way that would need to be formally addressed, eventually, but could wait for a day that wasn't this one. Pete Aldermore shook Silas Greer's hand, which appeared to surprise both of them. Beaufort Whaley sat down on a bench with his wife and his son, and the three of them stayed there for a while, not talking much, just sitting in the way of people who needed a moment to understand that the thing they'd been afraid of was not going to happen. Rourke moved through the room in the way he always did in groups, steady, peripheral, present, with occupying the center of anything. He talked to people. He said things that he meant. He shook hands and received back pats and accepted the particular gratitude of men who found gratitude difficult, which is to say he received a great deal of gruff brevity that meant more than it said. He looked for Lenora and found her outside. She was standing on the step in front of the meeting hall with her coat on and her notebook in her hand and her face turned toward the street and the cold October air. She wasn't watching anything in particular. She had the look of someone who had just finished something very large and was in the first few moments of adjusting to its absence. Came and stood beside her. "You should be in there," he said. "They want to thank you." "Keen's in there," she said. "He earned the thanks. He took the legal risk. You took it with him." He looked at her profile. "You guaranteed his fee." She was quiet for a moment. "You weren't supposed to know that. Keen told me this morning." Before the meeting, he paused. "You were going to use everything we had left as collateral without telling me." She turned and looked at him, and she had the expression she sometimes got when she'd done something she knew was right and was not entirely sure how the argument against it was going to land. "I didn't want you carrying it on top of everything else." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about saying something pointed about making decisions unilaterally. He thought about the conversation they'd had in the kitchen weeks ago, when she'd been furious with him for exactly the same thing. He thought about whether the irony of this was something she'd noticed or was currently hoping he hadn't. "Lenora, I know," she said, "you understand what you just did." "I made a decision I thought was right without fully consulting my partner," she said, with the exact flat directness of someone getting ahead of an argument they know they've already lost. "And I'm aware that this is precisely what I said to you 3 weeks ago was not partnership." "Yes." She looked back at the street. There was a pause. "I was scared," she said, "that Keen would hesitate. That if he understood the personal exposure that we were behind it, he'd be more cautious than we needed him to be." She paused. "So I went to him before you were with me, and I made the guarantee so that when we walked in together, it was already done." She was quiet. "It was the wrong way to do it." He stood there for a moment. "It worked," he said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at her. "Don't do it again." She looked at him sideways, something in her face that was not quite a smile but lived near one. "I believe I've said those exact words to you before." "You have," he said, "which is why I know what they mean." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the street, and he stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while, because sometimes silence is what a conversation needs at its center. Keen came out behind them after a while, with his satchel and his coat, and the look of a man who had done his best work and knew it. "The documents are filed," he said, "formally recorded. Calder's attorney is already preparing the transfer paperwork on the mortgages. I expect the First Territorial will have the Varden note back within the 2 weeks." He stopped beside them and looked at the street. "You should know Hartley is good. He'll have advised Calder to stay quiet and move on. There won't be any public statements, no contest of the proceeding, no attempt at a counter-narrative." He glanced at Lenora. "He's going to disappear from this valley quietly, and you'll probably never see him again." "Good," Rourke said. "The families." Keen started. "We'll be fine," Lenora said. "They were fine before he came. They'll need time to remember that." Keen nodded. He shook Rourke's hand, and then, slightly more formally, took Lenora's hand and held it for a moment in the way of someone making a deliberate acknowledgement. "That was one of the best pieces of financial detective work I've seen in 30 years of practice," he said. In case no one has said so plainly, she accepted it without deflecting. Thank you, Mr. Keene. You built a very solid case around it. He nodded and walked away down the street, and they watched him go. Inside the meeting hall, the noise of 40 people slowly becoming ordinary neighbors again filtered through the walls. Voices rising and falling, someone laughing. The particular social sounds of a situation resolving itself into something that could be lived with. Clara Kettrick appeared in the doorway. She looked at Lenora with the direct appraisal of a woman who had made up her mind about people slowly and rarely changed it once she had. Are you coming back in? She asked. In a minute, Lenora said. Clara looked between them and said nothing and went back inside. Rourke looked at the sky, the same October sky that had been overhead for every part of this the morning he'd stood outside waiting for a stagecoach, the evenings at the kitchen table with documents spread between them, the night of the meeting with 17 people in a room that held 12 comfortably. The Wyoming sky that paid no attention to any of it and was going to be there long after all of them were finished. 41 letters, he said. She glanced at him. I thought I knew you from them, he said. I thought I understood who was coming. He paused. I didn't. Not even close. Is that a complaint? No, he said. It's the opposite. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them, with the cold edge it always had this time of year, and she didn't step closer to avoid it the way some people might have. She stood in it, coat buttoned, notebook still in her hand, not quite smiling. You weren't what I expected either, she said. What did you expect? A lonely man with a broken ledger and a dead brother he hadn't made peace with. She paused. Someone who needed help. And you needed help, she said. But you weren't small. You were never small. She looked at him. The loneliness made you look smaller than you are. From the outside. He held her gaze for a moment. It was the kind of thing she said sometimes that arrived without warning and required a moment to land properly. Come inside, he said. Let them thank you. In a minute, she said again. This time she didn't mean it as a refusal. She meant it as a request for one more moment of the cold and the quiet, and the two of them standing outside a room full of people whose futures were intact because of what they'd done together over 5 weeks that had felt, in retrospect, like the longest and most alive stretch of time either of them had spent in years. He gave her the minute, then they went inside. The days after the meeting hall were strange in the way that days after large things often are too quiet, too ordinary, full of small tasks that felt slightly unreal against the weight of what had just happened. The mortgage transfer paperwork arrived from the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne on a Thursday 11 days after the meeting. Rourke signed it at the kitchen table while Lenora made coffee, and when he set down the pen, she brought the cups over and they sat across from each other and looked at the document for a moment without saying anything. It was a single page. It contained his name and the property description and the restored original terms and a bank seal. It was the most ordinary-looking thing that had ever meant this much. That's it, he said. That's it, she agreed. He folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box where he kept the ranch's important documents. He'd had the box for 11 years. It had his land deed in it, his brother Danny's watch, and the first letter Lenora had ever written him, the one about being the answer to "How are you?" for 11 years and looking at her life and finding neat columns that added up to very little. Close the box. The Kettricks got their transfer confirmation yesterday, Lenora said. Clara sent a note. Aldermore's should come by end of week. And the Whaleys? Keene says 10 days. The altered contract complicates the paperwork slightly. They have to formally void the amendment provisions before the original terms can be reinstated. She sipped her coffee. He's handling it. Rourke nodded. He sat with the quiet for a moment. Outside, the late October light was doing the thing it did in Wyoming this time of year, going gold and low and sideways. The kind of light that made everything look more significant than it probably was, or maybe exactly as significant as it was. Could never decide. We haven't talked about what comes next, he said. Lenora looked at him over her cup. For the ranch? For us. She set the cup down. This was not, he knew, a conversation she'd been avoiding. Lenora didn't avoid things, but it was one they'd both been letting sit at the edge of the room while the more urgent matters occupied the center. Now the center was clear. What would you like to say about it? She asked. He looked at the table. He thought about 41 letters, about the way she'd written things in them that she'd never said to a person, about what it meant that she'd crossed nearly 1,000 miles based on words on paper and had arrived and found those words were true and had stayed anyway when the truth got difficult. I want to say that I was wrong about something, he said, in the letters. I wrote that I wasn't looking for someone to fix me. I meant that, but I think I also thought underneath it, without saying it, that I wasn't fixable. That the parts that were broken after Danny stayed broken. He paused. Don't think that anymore. She was very still. I don't mean you fixed me, he said quickly. That's not what happened. I mean, something changed in the doing of things together. In having someone who didn't let me carry it alone, who got furious at me for hiding things and was right to be furious, who sat across from me at this table at 10 o'clock at night and said, "Tell me all of it," and meant it. He looked at her. Something loosened, something I'd been holding locked for 3 years. Lenora pressed her thumb against her lower lip. She was looking at the table. "I'm not easy to be with," she said finally. "I want you to know that I know that. I'm demanding and I form opinions quickly, and I don't soften things the way people sometimes want them softened, and I have a very hard time letting a problem sit unsolved, even when the hour is unreasonable." She looked up. "Those things aren't going to change. I know that. You're not bothered by it." "I'm occasionally bothered by it," he said honestly. "Specifically the part where you make decisions without telling me, because you've decided I'm carrying enough. I'm going to be bothered by that every time." "Fair," she said. "But no," he met her eyes. "I'm not bothered by who you are." She held his gaze for a long moment with the expression she wore when she was letting something actually land instead of processing it at arm's length. "The cabin needs work," he said. "I told you that in the letter, and it's more true now than it was then. The east wall loses heat all winter. The roof on the outbuilding needs replacing in the spring. The ranch is going to need years before it's fully what I want it to be." "I know all of that," she said. "I've been living in it for 6 weeks. I'm not promising easy," he said. "I'm promising honest. No more hidden burdens. No more decisions made without you." He paused. "And whatever this has been, I want it to keep being it. Formally. Properly." He stopped because he'd reached the end of the prepared part of what he wanted to say, and the rest of it was harder. "I don't have a ring. I didn't. I wasn't sure when to." "Rourke." He stopped. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "That was a proposal," she said, with the patient clarity of someone clarifying a ledger entry. "And the answer is yes." She picked up her coffee cup. "You can get a ring when you like. I'm not in particular need of one." He sat across from her in his kitchen with the October light coming through the window, and his mortgage restored, and 12 families intact, and this woman who had reorganized his ledgers and his life in roughly equal measure. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, and couldn't name precisely, and didn't need to. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed, and they finished their coffee. They married in November, beside Blackwillow Creek, on a morning that was cold enough to see your breath, but clear in the way Wyoming sometimes managed in late autumn, the sky a hard pure blue. Creek running quiet and dark between its frosted banks, the cottonwoods along the edge stripped down to their architecture. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Lenora had not wanted elaborate, and Rourke wouldn't have known how to produce it if she had. The territorial judge from Cinder Ridge performed it in about 15 minutes, which was efficient. What made it something more than a legal proceeding was the people standing around them. All 12 ranch families came. They stood along the creek bank in their good coats, with their breath-making small clouds, and the Kettricks were beside the Hammonds, without visible tension, and Pete Aldermore stood next to Silas Greer without crossed arms. And Beaufort Whaley had his wife on one side, and his father's pocket watch in his hand for reasons that were his own. Eleanor Beaumont stood in the front with her foreman, and she watched the proceeding with the expression of someone attending something she had correctly predicted would matter. Clara Kettrick cried, and made the same sound she'd made at the meeting hall about not crying. Rourke had no ring. He had something else, Lenora's first letter, the one he'd kept in the wooden box, worn soft along the fold lines, from being read more times than he'd admitted to anyone. He'd written on the back of it that morning, in handwriting that was careful because it needed to be, 6 words. "This was the first place I found you. He gave it to her beside the creek after the judge finished talking. She read it. She looked at him. That's the most practical romantic gesture I've ever encountered, she said. I'm a practical man. You are, she said. It's one of the things. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket against her chest. He kissed her, which he'd been working up to for 6 weeks, and which turned out, like most things they did together, to be less complicated than the anticipation of it. Someone behind them he suspected, Frank Kettrick, made an appreciative noise. Someone else told Frank to be quiet. Clara told them both to hush. The creek ran on without particular comment. December came hard, the way Wyoming Decembers did, and the east wall of the cabin lost heat, exactly as Rourke had warned it would. He spent 3 days in early December re-insulating it with materials he'd ordered from Cheyenne, and Lenora spent those same 3 days sitting at the kitchen table with a system she'd been building for 2 weeks, a ledger that tracked not just the Varden ranch accounts, but the basic financial health of all 12 Valley families, organized in a way that would allow her to see early if any of them were drifting back toward the kind of vulnerability that Calder had exploited. You're going to manage everyone's books, Rourke said, when he came in and found the scope of what she'd built. I'm going to make sure everyone can see their own books clearly, she said, correcting the framing without looking up. There's a difference. They're going to need to pay you for that. We'll figure something out. She turned a page. Clara Kettrick is already talking to 3 families on the Eastern Valley side who aren't part of our group. Their accounts are in the same condition ours were 18 months ago. She looked up. Overcharges they haven't noticed. Loan terms they haven't fully read. Rourke looked at his wife across the kitchen table. He thought about the woman who had arrived in a dusty green dress with a book under her arm, who had crossed 1,000 miles. Because she was looking for somewhere her skills would matter. And he thought that she had found it so thoroughly that it was already expanding beyond the boundary of what she'd originally come to do. You're building something, he said. She paused. Maybe. What is it? She set down her pen. She looked at the ledger and then out the window at the December yard, gray and hard with cold. There are women in this territory, she said slowly, who are managing ranch accounts they've never been taught to read. Widows who has inherited operations without knowing the first thing about what's in the loan documents. Daughters who are doing the books because their fathers don't trust anyone outside the family, but haven't shown them what they're actually looking at. She paused. There's knowledge that should be common and isn't. And the people who benefit from it not being common are the Garrick Sloans and the Von Calders. Rourke sat down. If people could read their own documents, she continued, if they understood what a standard territorial loan provision actually said versus what they'd been told it said, Calder's strategy doesn't work. You can't isolate people who already understand the shape of what's being done to them. She looked at him. I want to do something about that. What kind of something? She pressed her thumb against her lower lip. Reading. Numbers. Basic contract literacy. I've been running evening sessions at the kitchen table for 3 weeks, you've noticed, I think. I've noticed the lamp stays on late. Clara's been bringing her daughter. Eleanor's foreman comes on Thursdays. 2 of the Aldermore boys. She looked at the table. It's informal, but people are coming back. He was quiet for a moment. You want to make it formal. I want it to be something that continues when I can't be at the table. She met his eyes. A reading house. Something with books and basic instruction, and a place where the kind of knowledge that protects people is available to anyone who wants it, not just people who can afford to pay for it in Cheyenne. He thought about that. The outbuilding, he said. She looked at him. After the roof repair in spring. We could convert it. He looked at the window in the direction of the building. It's not large, but it's dry. Has a stove, he paused. If we put in shelving along the east wall. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating, something they'd expected to have to argue for. I didn't think you'd say that immediately, she said. You've been working up to asking me for 3 weeks, he said. I watched you do it. He held her gaze. You don't have to work up to things. Say them. She was quiet. Then, in the particular direct way she had when something landed. You're right? I'll work on that. Good. She looked at the ledger. Then at him. Then, with the smallest of smiles the real one, not the pleasant professional one she deployed on merchants and attorneys. Blackwillow Reading House, she said. Is that what you're calling it? It seems appropriate. She picked up her pen. The creek gave us the land. The land gave us the water. The water was worth saving. She made a note. May as well put its name on something that lasts. Spring came late that year, as it often did at elevation, and when it arrived, it came all at once, in the way of a decision that had been delayed. Too long the ground soft, and the creek running high with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods putting out their first tentative leaves over a week that went from frozen. To warm so fast the animals didn't know how to behave. Rourke replaced the outbuilding roof in April with help from 2 of the Kettrick boys, who arrived on a Saturday morning without being asked, because Frank had apparently decided they owed Rourke several Saturdays' worth of labor, and this was a reasonable way to begin settling the account. They were large young men who worked without much conversation and did good work, and Rourke appreciated both qualities. Lenora and Clara Kettrick spent the same Saturday building shelves, by which she meant Lenora measured, and Clara's eldest daughter sawed, and Clara herself supervised with the authority of a woman who had been running a working ranch for 30 years and had strong opinions about the level of shelving. The result was not beautiful. The joints were imperfect, and one shelf had a slight list that Rourke quietly corrected when no one was watching. But by evening there were 12 feet of shelving along the east wall of the outbuilding, and the stove was drawing properly. And the 2 windows Rourke had enlarged in March let in enough light that reading would be possible on most days without a lamp. Lenora stood in the middle of the room with sawdust on her dress and her hair coming down on the left side. It always came down on the left side first. He'd noticed and looked at what they'd made. It needs books, she said. I ordered some from Cheyenne, he said. They should come with the May supply run. She turned and looked at him. When did you do that? February. She stared at him. You'd been talking about it since December in the way you talk about things you've already decided, he said. I ordered a basic collection, mathematics primer, 2 grammar texts, a survey of territorial law, 3 novels because I thought people might stay longer if there was something to enjoy. He paused. I might have also written to the county school board in Cheyenne about certification requirements for informal educational programs. Her mouth opened slightly. They wrote back, he said. The requirements are not onerous. Keene's already looked at them. She stood in the middle of the sawdust-floored outbuilding on a late April afternoon and looked at her husband with an expression he had never quite seen on her before and couldn't immediately catalog. It was somewhere in the vicinity of undone, not upset, not overwhelmed, but the look of a person whose careful interior organization had just encountered something it hadn't prepared a folder for. You did that without telling me, she said. I wanted to be sure it was possible before I said anything. He held her gaze. I know. That's the same argument I've already been told is not acceptable. It is the same argument, she said. I know, he said. I'm working on it. She looked at him for another moment. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around him with the same decisive lack of ceremony she'd used. The day she arrived, not a soft moment, not a tender movie moment. Just a person choosing contact with another person, because it was what the situation called for, and she had decided to stop being careful about it. He held her in the sawdust-smelling outbuilding with the imperfect shelves and the repaired roof and the spring light coming through the enlarged windows, and thought that this, exactly this, the imperfection and the realness, and the 2 of them figuring it out as they went, was what he had wanted without knowing it for a very long time. Don't do it again, she said into his shoulder. No, he said. I won't. She stepped back and pushed her hair off her face and looked at the shelves with the expression of someone who had moved past the emotional moment and was already thinking about organization systems. The law texts go near the door, she said. People are more likely to pick up something familiar first. Mathematics in the middle. Novels on the far end, so people have to walk past everything else to get to them. Strategic placement, he said. It's all strategic placement, she said, and went to find a broom. The Blackwillow Reading House opened on the first Thursday of June, which was an evening that a dozen people showed up for, and which Lenora treated with the same practical lack of ceremony she brought to everything no speech. No formal marking of the occasion, just the door open and the lamp lit and the shelves stocked and people arriving and sitting down and picking up books. Clara Kettrick brought her daughter and her daughter's friend. Pete Aldermore's younger son came alone, which surprised his father enough that Pete mentioned it to Rourke the following week, with the expression of a man who wasn't sure whether to be proud or confused and had settled on both. Eleanor Beaumont sent her foreman with a donation of 4 books from her late husband's collection, accompanied by a note in Eleanor's handwriting that said only, "These should be used." By September, the Thursday sessions had grown to include 2 families from the Eastern Valley who hadn't been part of the original 12, referred by Clara Kettrick, who had apparently appointed herself a kind of informal ambassador for the enterprise. A woman named Ruth Granger, who worked in the Cinder Ridge boarding house, started coming on Tuesday afternoons when the house was quiet. And she turned out to have a facility for numbers that she'd had no idea about because no one had ever given her the materials to discover it. Ruth Granger, by the following spring, was keeping the books for 3 Cinder Ridge businesses whose owners had been managing their own accounts with varying degrees of accuracy for years. Lenora told Rourke about this over supper one evening with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a thing they built do what it was built for. She found it herself, Lenora said. I just gave her the materials. That's teaching, Rourke said. I suppose it is. She seemed to sit with that for a moment, like it was something she was adjusting to. She had not, he'd noticed, ever called herself a teacher. She called herself a bookkeeper. She called what she did at the reading house instruction, or sessions, or the Thursday thing. The word teacher seemed to belong to a version of her identity she hadn't fully claimed yet. You're good at it, he said. I'm good at explaining things, she said. I don't know if that's the same. It's the main part, he said. She looked at him across the table. When did you become the one who says the direct thing? I've always said the direct thing, he said. You've just been too busy talking to notice. She laughed, the real one, short and slightly surprised, the one that arrived before she could compose it. He'd been working to earn that laugh for 8 months, and it still felt like something worth the effort every time. The letters stayed in the wooden box. The wooden box stayed on the shelf beside the window in the bedroom, where Rourke put it the day the mortgage transfer came through, and where it remained through the winter and the spring and into the 2nd year of their marriage. Lenora never moved it. Rourke opened it, sometimes not often, not with any particular plan, just the way a person touches something significant to confirm it's still there. One evening in late autumn of their 2nd year, he took out the first letter. Her letter, the one about neat columns adding up to very little. He sat on the edge of the bed and read it in the lamplight, the way he'd read it probably 30 times before, the paper so familiar now, it felt like something that had always existed. Came in from the other room and saw him and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she sat beside him on the bed and looked at the letter in his hands. Still read it, she said. Sometimes. She was quiet. Then she reached over and gently took the letter from his hands and folded it carefully along its old fold lines and put it back in the box and closed the lid. You don't need the letters to find me anymore, she said. He looked at her in the lamplight. She was different than she'd been when she arrived, not softer exactly, not easier. But something had settled in her that hadn't been settled when she stepped off the stagecoach in a dusty green dress with a book under her arm and her whole life in one bag. She'd arrived looking for somewhere she was wanted rather than merely useful. He thought she'd found it. He thought she'd also found something she hadn't known to look for the specific dignity of being known completely by another person and chosen anyway. He understood that feeling. He'd found it too. I know where you are, he said. Yes, she said. You do. She leaned against him, which she did more easily now than she used to, the guarded self-sufficiency still there, still fundamental to who she was, but less defended, less like armor and more like a preference. He put his arm around her, and they sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight, with the wooden box closed between them and the 2nd Wyoming winter building itself outside the walls. There are things you understand about a life only from inside it. You cannot know from the outside that what looks like a mail-order arrangement between a struggling rancher and a Cincinnati bookkeeper will become something that protects 12 families from losing their land. You cannot know that what looks like 2 careful, Damaged people being practical about their loneliness will become the specific kind of love that's made of work and honesty and the willingness to be wrong in front of another person. You cannot know that the woman who crossed 1,000 miles looking for somewhere to be useful will build something that outlasts the crisis that brought her there a room with imperfect shelves and second-hand books, where Ruth Granger discovers. She's good at numbers, where Aldermore boys learn to read a contract, where the kind of knowledge that protects people gets passed from hand to hand in the particular unglamorous way that protection actually moves through the world. Rourke Varden spent 11 years building a ranch alone because he believed that was the only way to be sure it was truly his. He was wrong about that. The things most truly yours are the ones you built with someone else who cared about them the same way you did. Lenora Blythe spent 11 years being useful in ways that didn't matter and looking at her life in neat columns that added up to nothing she wanted. She crossed a territory to find something real and found it by refusing, at every turn, to pretend that a hard thing was simple, or that a dishonest arrangement was acceptable, or that she was too fragile to carry the weight of the actual situation. The weight is always the actual situation. The people who tell you otherwise are either protecting themselves or selling something. The morning of their first embrace on the road outside Cinder Ridge, Lenora said it felt like coming home. She meant it as a feeling, an instinct, something she couldn't quite explain even to herself. She understood later what she'd been reaching toward: not the ranch, not the territory, not the practical arrangement of a life in Wyoming. She'd been reaching toward the specific experience of being fully known by another person, of having her real self, the demanding, precise, unsoft, capable, occasionally infuriating real self, not just tolerated but wanted. Home is not a location. It is not a building you can lose to a debt collector or a scheming speculator or a bad Wyoming winter. It is not the land your father broke his back on, or the property your husband spent 11 years building piece by piece. Home is what happens between people when they stop pretending to be less complicated than they are, when they carry the hard things together instead of hiding them from each other, when they choose every morning, in the ordinary, unheroic way of people who are tired and imperfect and still getting it wrong, sometimes, to keep showing up for the life they're building. Rourke and Lenora Varden kept showing up. The ranch grew slowly, the way real things grow, not smoothly, not without setbacks, but steadily, season by season, with the accumulated weight of years of work that doesn't look like much in any individual day and looks like everything across a decade. The Blackwillow Reading House became something that extended beyond the valley, a model, eventually, for 2 other frontier communities that sent someone to learn how it worked and went home to build something similar with local materials and local people, and the same basic conviction that knowledge shared is protection distributed. Keene referenced it in a territorial education filing in 1891 as an example of community-driven literacy infrastructure. He didn't name the people behind it. Lenora, who read the filing, said that was exactly right. The letters stayed in the wooden box. The wooden box stayed on the shelf. And on winter evenings, when the east wall held its heat now because they'd rebuilt it properly, and the lamp was burning on the table between them, and the reading house was locked for the night across the yard, Rourke Varden sometimes looked at his wife, across whatever they were working on the ranch accounts she still kept with the precision of someone who had been a bookkeeper for 11 years before she was anything else, the letters from families in other counties asking about how the Thursday sessions worked, the novel she was reading, with her thumb in it to hold her place, and thought about the February night he'd sat at this same table with a blank page in front of him and written the only honest thing he could think of. I am not sure I know how to do this. He still didn't entirely. Still learning. They both were. That, he'd come to understand, was not the failure he'd once taken it for. It was the point. The learning was the whole point. The not knowing and the trying anyway. The getting it wrong and sitting with the discomfort of having been wrong, the choosing each other in the specific full information, way knowing all the difficult parts. Having seen each other at the worst angles was not a lesser version of love than the one where everything comes easily. It was the real version, the only version that holds. Outside, Blackwillow Creek ran on through the dark, the same as it had always run, indifferent and constant, carrying snowmelt from the mountains to the valley, the way it had for longer than anyone in the valley had been alive to notice it. It had been worth saving. It had been worth every document and every difficult conversation and every night at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low. So had they. The winter of their 3rd year was the mildest anyone in the valley could remember. Not warm Wyoming was never warm in January, and anyone who told you otherwise had never spent a January in Wyoming, but manageable in the way that made the work feel possible instead of punishing. The cattle came through the cold months in better condition than they had in years. Creek stayed clear. The reading house stayed open 4 evenings a week instead of 3 because there were enough people coming that 3 no longer contained them comfortably. Rourke noticed the change in the valley, the way you notice a change in a person you see every day, not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of small things that one day arrange themselves into a picture you can see all at once. The Kettricks and the Hammonds had mended the fence dispute formally in the spring of their 2nd year, with Lenora mediating the boundary conversation at Clara's request, and producing a written agreement that both families signed and that Frank Kettrick later said was fairer than anything a territorial court would have given them. Aldermore and Greer had not become friends. That was probably too much to ask of 2 men who had been adversaries for a decade, but they had become something more useful than friends. They had become neighbors who understood that their interests were connected, which was the foundation that friendship sometimes grew from, and was, in the meantime, sufficient. Beaufort Whaley paid off his restored mortgage 18 months ahead of schedule. He sent Rourke a note that said only, "Tell your wife thank you." Couldn't figure out how to say it to her face, Rourke told Lenora. She read the note, folded it, and said, "He'll figure out how to say it eventually. Some people need more runway." She was right. He said it himself, directly, the following spring at a valley gathering, in front of his wife and son, and it cost him something to do it, and he did it anyway. And that was worth more than the easy version would have been. Eleanor Beaumont died in the February of the 3rd year. Not suddenly, she had been slowing through the autumn in the way of people whose bodies have decided on a direction and are moving toward it with or without their permission. Stayed on her ranch until the final 2 weeks, which was what she'd wanted, and her foreman of 15 years managed the property through the winter with the efficiency of a man who had been paying attention for a long time. She left the ranch to her niece in Denver, who arrived in March and turned out to be a capable woman in her late 30s who had her aunt's eyes and her aunt's manner of asking a question as though she already whether the answer was going to be satisfactory. Came to the reading house on a Thursday in April and stayed for 3 hours and left with 2 books under her arm and returned the following Thursday. Lenora told Rourke about it that evening with the specific quiet of someone passing on information that contained more than it appeared to. "She's staying," Lenora said. "She told Clara she's decided to learn the operation and run it herself." Eleanor would have approved, Rourke said. Eleanor did approve, Lenora said. There was a letter. The foreman gave it to the niece when she arrived. Apparently Eleanor wrote it in November. She paused. The foreman said Eleanor told him not to look surprised when a woman decided to stay and make something of the place. Rourke thought about Eleanor Beaumont standing on her creek bank and watching 12 ranch families make a decision that would determine what the valley looked like for a generation. He thought about her saying these should be used and sending her husband's books to fill a shelf in an outbuilding with imperfect joinery. She knew, he said. She knew, Lenora agreed. The letter from the Wyoming Territorial Education Board arrived on a Tuesday in May of the 4th year, addressed to Lenora Varden at the Blackwillow Reading House, Cinder Ridge, Wyoming Territory. She opened it at the kitchen table while Rourke was doing the morning feeding. She read it once. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. When Rourke came in and found her sitting there with the letter in her hand and the coffee going cold beside her, he stopped in the doorway. "What is it?" She looked up. Her expression was the one she wore when something had arrived that she hadn't prepared a response for. "They want to use the reading house model," she said, formally, as a template for frontier community literacy programs across the territory. She looked back at the letter. "There's a proposal here for a small territorial grant, enough to fund book purchases and materials for 3 years. And they're asking if I would be willing to consult with 2 other communities who want to establish similar programs." She set the letter on the table. They found out about Ruth Granger. She apparently wrote to someone in the board's office about how she learned bookkeeping. Rourke came to the table and read the letter over her shoulder. He read it carefully. "Are you going to say yes?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "The consulting would mean travel. Not extensive, but some." She looked up at him. "It would mean time away from the ranch." "The ranch will stand," he said. "I managed it alone for 11 years. I can manage it while you're in another county for a week." "You managed it badly for 11 years," she said. "Your ledgers were a catastrophe." "They were," he agreed. "Cattle stayed alive." She looked at him. He held her gaze with the expression of a man who had learned, over 4 years, that the most useful thing he could do, in moments when she was deciding something important, was to make it clear that he had already decided it was her decision to make. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll say yes," she wrote back that afternoon. The grant came through in August. By the following spring, 2 communities in adjacent counties had their own reading houses, smaller, improvised, imperfect in the specific ways that new things built by people who care about them are always imperfect, and the women running them had both come to Cinder Ridge for a week in October to sit with Lenora and understand how it worked and take that understanding home. Rourke, for that October week, managed the ranch, kept the reading house stove lit for the evening sessions, and made sure there was food on the table when Lenora came in late. He said nothing about the hours she kept. He brought her coffee without being asked. On the last evening of the visiting women's stay, he came into the reading house to bank the stove and found the 3 of them still there at the reading table, deep in a conversation about contract literacy and county school board requirements, none of them paying any attention to the hour. He banked the stove. He refilled the lamp. He left without interrupting. He thought, walking back to the cabin in the October dark, about a February night 11 years ago, when he'd sat at a kitchen table with a blank page in front of him and tried to write the honest thing. He thought about everything that had grown from that honesty, not smoothly, not easily, not without cost, but genuinely and permanently. He thought about Danny, which he did less often, now but more peacefully, the grief having settled into something that had always been its final shape, even when it didn't feel like it yet, not absence but presence, a different kind of presence. The kind that stays in the hands of someone you taught to do something, and in the parts of yourself you built in response to losing someone and didn't know you were building. He went inside and put a log on the fire and sat in the chair nearest the hearth and waited for his wife to come home. She came in an hour later, still talking about something with the 2 visiting women at the door, laughing at something one of them said with the laugh that arrived before she could compose it, the real one. She said goodnight to them and closed the door and turned and found him sitting by the fire with his book open and unread on his knee. She hung up her coat. She came and sat in the chair across from him. "You waited up," she said. "I was reading," he said, indicating the open book. She looked at the book, then at him. "You're on the same page you were on this morning." "It's a slow chapter," he said. She looked at him with the expression that lived between exasperation and affection, which was the expression she wore more than any other and which he had come to understand was the one that meant she was exactly where she wanted to be. "Come to bed," she said. "The chapter will keep." He closed the book. The fire settled behind them as they went down the hall, and the reading house across the yard held its books in the dark, and Blackwillow Creek ran on through the Wyoming night, cold and clear and carrying everything down from the mountains to the valley below, the way it always had, the way it always would. Some things, built right and tended honestly, simply last. That is the whole of it. That is enough.